United Dairy Families of California and this process that we're engaged in, what this looks like and how they see this going forward. And then after that, you're going to hear from Don Schiplehood, who's with the Department of Food and Agriculture. And this is to take away some of the ambiguity about what is the legislative authority that exists here that allows the QIP to operate and allows quota to be funded. And what are the provisions specifically relating to how that program is addressed if a petition comes in, and what kind of petition. And so I know that legislation can get a little bit dry and difficult to read, but we brought Dawn in to try to give an English interpretation of what is in the law. And so we really appreciate Dawn coming and being willing to talk about that. And then Maren, of course, you all met Maren and Matt at the last phase of meetings, and so they'll take you through the rest of the agenda. But I just want to again thank you all for coming. Obviously, this is a forum that we want feedback. So if everyone sits here and doesn't say a word, it's not going to be a very good meeting. So be prepared to engage in that discussion. With that, I'll pass it to Craig Gordon to provide some comments on behalf of Stop QIP.
The meeting yesterday down in Chino went really well. Everyone was engaged, and it went fast. The 3 hours went real fast, probably because the subject matter was very interesting to go through. They had done a really good job, and you'll enjoy this meeting. I'm supposed to give you an update of what we're doing. We have a petition currently with 335 signatures. We need 248 that we put on hold. It's the petition to terminate under the section of Chapter 3, and that's under the 21 code, but it's the one we filed originally on. So we have that, we put that on hold. The reason we put it on hold was we're filing a new petition. We're gathering the signatures right now, which I'll discuss here without the differences between the two, but it's under Chapter 3.5. And 3.5 has a lower threshold where we only need 51%, but the other one we need 65%. So we feel that is we can win that one quite easily, we think. But we're still participating here as we made a promise to come to these meetings and see if we can work out some compromise. We're willing to work out a compromise, and that's why we're participating. So that's what we're doing out there on the field. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me, AJ, some of the other guys that are here. We'll answer any questions you guys have. We appreciate you being here, and it's a very difficult thing to be addressing, as we all know. The quota is a tough issue, so thank you.
At least it's not toilet paper stuck to his shoe like allegedly Trump did. I'm Dino Giacomazzi. I am a recovering dairyaholic. Have been not in the dairy business now for a couple of days. Anyway, I'm staying on to participate in the United Dairy Families of California in order to see this process through to the end. I personally believe that that the dairy industry is the most important industry in California by magnitudes. When I went to when we made the decision to shut the dairy down, and I started making a list of all the people that I had to call to tell them that we were shutting down, I mean, it just became huge. And for those of you who came to our sale, you probably saw the poster that we made thanking all of those people. I mean, it is, when you consider how many people, it was something like 60 people on my 1,000-cow dairy that make a living off of the dairy industry besides my employees and my family. And in addition to that, there's, I'm going to become an almond farmer, already an almond farmer. Many of you are almond farmers. The almond farmers depend on dairy cows for, eating hulls and taking shells. And I mean, no industry in this ag industry can succeed in California without the dairy industry. So it's important to me that there's stability in this industry and that there's unity in this industry and that you're able to survive and keep this thing going for your family and the next generation down the road, and that you're here to also support the rest of agriculture. So what we came up with as an organization, the United Dairy Families of California, we were founded on the principle that while there is certainly opportunities to end quota under a referendum or end it in some other fashion, and now there's many ways that you can end quota. We believe that the right thing to do is to find out a consensus opinion about what the dairy industry wants to do and move together to do something, right? That there's two paths that we can take. We can either be forced into a decision or we can work together. There's sort of the division version and there's the unity version. So the United Dairy Families of California has developed a process which we think is the best, quickest, and most efficient way to come up with this sort of industry consensus. And the first phase was called the think tank, and we went through this phase already where you guys came and you gave us every possible idea. We did not anticipate how prolific you guys were in terms of your ideas, and we had originally set up a timeline that was shorter than what we are currently on. And we're extending our timelines now because of the sheer volume of information that was needed to be dealt with. I mean, we came out of this thing with something like, Martin and Matt had 9 proposals, and with some variations. There's I think 13 documents that we have to consider here, and this is a pretty heavy lift for any one person to do, let alone an entire industry of people. So we believe that this important issue, which we've basically been dealing with for 50 years, and for my entire life, quota has been, I was born in the year that quota came into existence, that a few more months is a fair way to come up with a good plan and to do what's right for the industry. So today we're in the producer feedback phase, which we like to call the Shark Tank, and today is an opportunity for you guys to respond and to comment about what you like about or what you don't like about these 9 ideas. None of these ideas should be construed as being the opinion of any of the co-ops, of StopQuip, or of the dairy families. These are ideas that came from the producers. Maren and Matt took that information and to the best of their ability, tried to present it very factually. And also these should not really be considered as whole ideas, right? So if you look at an idea, it's really just a concept for you to be considering. It's not like we're going to ask you, at this point to pick one forever, because we might end up with something that is a combination of several of these ideas. Okay, so we're just putting them in silos right now so that we can discuss each one simply. And then after today, the phase 3, today is sort of the kickoff of phase 2. And what's happening next is that over the next 2 weeks, so next week and the week after, the United Dairy Families will be holding regional committee meetings in all parts of the state, like we did, kind of in the lead up to phase 1, where all of you are invited to come and participate and go through these proposals in more depth, right? Like really take a chance to consider what they mean and what you like, what you dislike. Send feedback to Matt and Maren. You can ask questions, you can get your questions answered, and then from there, express a preference again, right? So you might have a different opinion about some of these proposals once you've had a longer look at them, okay? Because we know today is short and it's just sort of an introduction. When that phase terminates, we will, in 2 weeks from now, we will deliver that information to Maren and Matt, and then we're giving them until January 15th, middle of January, to come up with the documents for phase 3. Phase 3 is going to look just like this, where we're going to have meetings where we're going to look at those proposals, but we're going from 9 down to 3. And then at those meetings, we're going to essentially ask you to pick one idea. And then hopefully, if everything goes well, we will have the majority will have supported one idea. If the majority supports that one idea, then as an industry, we will bring that idea back to you, and we will talk about that one idea as an industry, and then we will implement that idea however it takes, whether we have to do a referendum or if we can just go to the department and they can make the change. Whatever the pathway is, we will implement. So that's what's laid out before us. Our expectation is that by the middle of February, so let's just call it by the farm show, we should know exactly the plan. One idea, moving forward, one thing, we're going to get it done by the farm show, right? So that is, and then, in the beer garden at the farm show, we can talk about the plan. Sound fair? All right. So, with that being said, I'm going to move it on now to Marin, and we're going to get this thing going, because it's only going to take 3 hours of sitting here watching slides. So, let's get going.
Morning, everyone. Morning. Thanks for coming back. So briefly about the agenda for today. For the first 45 minutes or so, we'll have Mr. Donald Schipelhood from CDFA, who is going to take us through the legislative framework, constraints for solutions and petitions.
Can you move that speaker back so we can see the screen?
Dina, that's a request for you. Yeah.
It can't go back any further.
No?
No, I can put it on the ground maybe, just to see if that works.
Okay.
Someone come up here with feedback. If we do, we'll get feedback. We can try it. What did you say? Let's go. Let's go. No, let's all right, let's go back. Hold on. This time,
Gonna be good with feedback now? Test 1, 2, 3, 4. Falls off the cliff? No? Okay. I think we're good. Does everyone see better now? Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dina. Thank you, the crew. Okay. So let me see where I can stand. All right. So we'll have Don Schipelhood go first for the first 45 minutes. He's going to present for about 20-25. Then we'll do a Q&A. We'll go through the details of that when we get to it. After that, Matt and I will go through 11 proposals broken down in 3 sessions. So we'll have the first break after dawn, and if you guys want it, we can have one more break after session 2. Yesterday in Chino, they didn't want to have a second break. Everybody was going to restrooms while I was talking, so when I said now is the break, nobody's like, well, we don't have to go. So, so we were done in 3 hours. And that's the plan for today. Yeah. So the first on the agenda today is Donald Schipelhood. Donald is the branch chief of the dairy marketing branch. They are the part of the CDFA in charge of implementing QUIP. When the petition comes in, Don and his crew are the ones to validate whether the signatures are all good or to throw out those that are not eligible. And then they are the one organizing the public hearings, calling for referendums, etc. So Don is a pretty key guy in all of this. Been extremely helpful for the last few months to Matt and I as we were collecting the data and preparing this, and I hope you will all give a warm welcome to Don.
So good turnout today. Good to see a good participation here. The Secretary, through this process, has been very interested in you as an industry determining your own path. So to have this many folks attending today is a good indication that you are definitely interested in that path and your own input being a part of that. So my presentation yesterday apparently went a little long. Was asked to try and trim about 10 minutes off of that, so you are going to miss out on the elementary school classroom style me reading text to you. That is very boring. We'll hit the text, the important parts of it, and talk about what they say. Let me just jump right in. One question was raised yesterday towards the end on the words must and may and what those really mean. There was a reference to a lawsuit questioning whether or not the word must meant must. There is a section of code, the Food and Ag Code, section 47, that says must is mandatory and may is discretionary. So must means must and may means may. So in milk regulation, pricing, whatnot, there's a group of chapters in the Food and Ag Code that tell us how and what to do. Those chapters primarily are chapters 1, which deals with manufacturing grade milk, grade B milk. Chapter 2, which dealt with pricing of grade A milk. That gave us the authority of having the stabilization marketing plan, the pricing formulas that the state administered for many years. Then chapter 2.5, which is a trust fund, which protects you as producers from non-payment by handlers. Chapter 3, which came along well after the class pricing. Chapter 3 allowed for milk pooling. That's where quota was initially issued to you, the producer. And then the latest addition was Chapter 3.5, which was added in 1993 that gave the $1.70 spread for the price difference between the over-base milk and quota milk. So that's all important to know, kind of the background as I go forward, because there's some authority that we're going to talk about in both Chapter 3.0, again, that was what initially implemented the quota program, or milk pooling program, and then separate authority in 3.5, which initially had given us authority or the mandate to have a $1.70 spread in the pool prices. And if I make it all the way through this presentation without spilling that cup of water, I will be happy. All right, so the next slide is just, I'm going to start off in Chapter 3.0. Those that attended yesterday got to hear me read this. I'm going to spare the rest of you that are here today. Basically, in Chapter 3.0, there's two primary code sections that talk about the the referendum and petition process. And so these first couple slides are the text in order as written. 62716, here's the first part of 62717. Jumps down to the second part of 62717. 62717 is a very lengthy code section. Not the funnest read, but a very important read nonetheless. So yesterday again read this. I'm not going to do that today in the discussion of time. So I'm going to jump into what the code section says. Again, those first two sections or slides were the code language in order. I've broken it down and rearranged the order a little bit for discussion here. And so what does this code section say? Well, it talks about if the department receives a petition, what do we have to do? First thing that we have to do is hold a hearing. Talks about when the department has to do something and when they may do something. So basically when the secretary can exercise her discretion and when she can't do something or the legislation has directed her to do something specifically. So in this language, we go through, it always talks about a public hearing. We have to have a public hearing. So the director may amend a plan, and so we're assuming that we're going to receive a petition, and what does the industry want to do based on that petition? So if a petition comes in and asks us to amend the plan, we have to have a public hearing. We hold that public hearing, and then based on what the secretary finds, the secretary can amend the plan. So she can amend it if she finds it's necessary, that amendment is necessary to effectuate the purpose. But she can't just make any change that she wants on her own discretion. So after the hearing, she can, two things. She can have the hearing on her own motion. So if she decided today that she wanted to have a hearing on a plan, on a pool plan, and she could do that. She could maybe send a notice out to you, the industry, hey, we're going to have a hearing in X number of days. Or she could do it based on a petition from an individual. Any interested party can say, hey, Madam Secretary, we'd like to have a hearing to discuss the quota implementation plan. And she could call a hearing based on that petition. Or she can be required to have a hearing. And so where is the required? Required is down here. The hearing shall be held upon a receipt of a petition signed by producers representing not less than 25% of the total number of all producers and not less than 25% of the total production of all producers. So if we get a petition signed by 25% of you, the grade A producers, and 25% of those 25 that sign represent 25% of all the grade A milk in the state, then we would be obligated to hold a hearing. So again, based on that hearing, a couple things could happen. If the public hearing is held on her own motion or the motion or a petition or a request by any one party, she has more options. She can hear the testimony and say, thank you for your time. We think everything's going along just fine and we aren't going to do anything. She could terminate the QUIP. She could amend the QUIP. Both of these may require a referendum. The amendment talks about the director may make non-substantive changes on her own, but if there's a substantive change, then we would have to put that out to a referendum. And so that's what I'm talking about here is that the substantive question exists, then it goes to referendum. All right, so that's not the end of this. This is just, again, a portion of that code section. In addition to holding a hearing, if we get that petition signed by not less than 25% of the producers, representing 25% of the milk, the director shall, again, shall being mandatory, may be being discretionary. She shall submit the plan to a petition, a referendum for termination. So if we get that 25%, in the prior slide I talked about we'd have to go to a hearing, we would have to go to a hearing. But we would also have to submit the plan to a referendum to decide whether or not you, the producers, want to terminate. So this 25% threshold, we'll see that again later under the authority of 3.5. Right now, again, we're looking at the authority in chapter 3.0. When the legislation was added to clarify that the department had the authority to have the QUIP, the legislature pointed us back to this language in holding the referendum, and you'll see the difference as I go along. We're still here on chapter 62717, which again is in chapter 3. Here's an important distinction between the two different pieces of legislation. So in this one, if the director finds the producers have assented in writing to the proposed pooling plan, so initially this was set up to talk about the initial implementation of the plan, but it also applies if the department wants to, or the secretary wants to amend the plan. We start talking about the votes that have to be counted. So if the petition comes in and says, hey, we want to terminate QUIP, and we put the ballot out there, the ballot says, do you think QUIP should be terminated? A few things have to happen. First, we have to have petitions returned from at least 51% of you, the producers. So that's our first requirement. And then we need one of the two other things to happen. And that is a vote count. So there's two different scenarios where it would pass. One is 65% of you, the producers, vote. And of those that voted, produce 51% or more of the milk. All good? Then you would, the QUIP would be terminated. Or if you didn't have 65% of the total number of votes, but you had 51% of the votes, but those votes represented 65% of the milk, then QUIP could be terminated as well. So big difference between chapter 3 and 3.5 is this vote count the 6551 versus 45165. And then you'll see a rather significant difference as we get into chapter 3.5. So here we are in chapter 3.5. Chapter 3.5 initially was added again to require the $1.70 spread between the quote price and the overbase price. There was language in there that requires this code section, or excuse me, this chapter to remain operative until you, the producers, voted to get rid of it. We added, or the legislature, I should say, added code section 62757, which is the code section that we use to promulgate and administer the QUIP. And so that was added again to chapter 3.5, initially the $1.70 spread chapter. But this chapter, including 62757, it has language that allows for a petition and a referendum as well. In here, there's more code sections that talk about the petition process and the referendum, but they're much shorter, easier to read. First of them being 62751. This is a code section that basically says, okay, you have that $1.70, it's going to stay in place, it's going to remain operative until you, the producers, have voted in a referendum to suspend this operation. So what do we have to do in order to do that, in order to get to a referendum? First thing we'd have to do, again, we may hold a public hearing. So the secretary could hold a public hearing at any time. On her own motion, she could call and say, we're going to have this hearing. She could do it based on interested party sending something in and saying, hey, Madam Secretary, we're going to have a hearing. So again, could consider whether or not this entire chapter, chapter 3.5, including the language that allows for the QUIP to operate, should be suspended. So she can do that on her own motion, or here's that shall word again. She shall hold that hearing if we receive a petition that is signed by at least 25% of the producers that have 25% of the milk. So that threshold is the same, 25% of producers, 25% of milk, we have to do something. In chapter 3.0, we had to go to a public hearing. It also was very clear in there that said we would have to go to referendum. This section, or chapter, is not quite as restrictive. It says we have to have a public hearing if we get that 25%. It does not say that you have to go to referendum. This chapter does allow for a referendum. And here, the next code section, 62753, talks about the referendum. It doesn't direct us how to get there. It doesn't say you have to have this referendum, if this, then that. So there's some discretion here at the secretariat level. So we hold a hearing based on her decision, her recommendation, or her findings. Then we may go to referendum. If not, well then, all through, all done, we'll go about business as we were conducting it prior. But if she does say that we are going to do a referendum, the code tells us how long that referendum has to be out there. So we have to put it out to vote for 60 days. And she may, she may extend that process an additional 30 days if she thinks it's necessary to get the number of votes to get the threshold that we'll talk about in a moment. 62754 goes into the ballot process. I kind of skipped over the ballot process on the chapter 3, but essentially the legislation says if you go to a referendum, this is what the ballot's going to say. It has the same type of language here in 3.5. So each producer shall have one vote, and the vote shall be individually cast in order to prevent block voting. That same language is in chapter 3 and 3.5. We want you as an individual producer to have a say-so in how your program is run and what happens to it. We don't allow the co-ops to block vote on your behalf. And so we go to a referendum. The ballot form shall substantially be as follows. Shall, chapter 3.5. Again, it's the entire chapter, not just the quip, but you would have to be voting on the chapter in its entirety. So tells us how it substantially has to be laid out, yes or no. In addition, the ballot shall include statement of voters' total production. So basically, we would send you a ballot. Mr. and Mrs. Dairyman, here's your ballot, yes or no. We also have to put on there, based on what was reported to us, here's the production that we have reported from your dairy farm and where it was marketed to. So we would use that production number when we were weighting the vote or tallying the vote. If you as a producer look at that number and say, hey, well, mine's different than that, you can contact us and we can correct that. So here's where things start to change significantly from chapter 3.0. In chapter 3.5, once we've gone to a referendum, if you, the producers, don't vote to keep it, it is gone. And so how does that work? The secretary shall find that producers have consented to continue the operation if the secretary finds on a statewide basis that not less than 51% of the total number of eligible producers in the state have voted in the referendum, and that 51% or more of the eligible producers who voted in the referendum and who produced 51% or more of the total fluid milk produced in the state during the calendar month next preceding the month of commencement of the referendum, blah, blah, blah. And start reading this and it is kind of, head starts spinning. Basically what it's saying is you have to meet 3 different criteria in order to pass. First, at least 51% of eligible producers have to vote. And of those voting, at least 51% of those voting have to vote yes. And of those voting yes, they have to have produced at least 51% of the milk that was included in that vote. So it's not 51% of the statewide production, but just 51% of the milk voting. So Craig mentioned they would have to have 51%. Well, no. They would only need 49.1%. If they had 49.1% of the milk or the votes, the yes side would not meet this 51 threshold. So if the yes side didn't meet the threshold, what happens? Well, then the secretary finds that a vote favorable to the continued operation of this chapter has not been given. Interesting wording. Why it was worded that way, I don't know. It is what it is, though. So if the vote has not been given, then the secretary shall so certify to the Secretary of State and declare this chapter, again, all of chapter 3.5, including the authority to have the standalone program, declare this chapter inoperative, and basically at that point then, the authority for the standalone program would be gone, the whip would be gone, and we would revert back to the pool plan that was in place in 1993, which did not have the $1.70 spread. It was driven entirely by class price revenue. I was asked this morning, what would you do if you didn't have that $1.70 spread? I'm not sure what you would do with that. I don't know how you would determine how much to pay out to Portland, or if you could. In the last section of this, or piece of this code section, just says the secretary may reveal the names of producers who have voted or whose votes have been received, and to either the opponents or proponents of the continued operation of this chapter. And this next piece of language is in both chapters. However, whether individual producers voted for or against the continued operation of this chapter shall be kept confidential. So we will never tell anybody how you voted. We might tell folks if you voted. In the past, we have notified folks Specifically, the co-ops would come to us and say, hey, have all my members voted yet? No, here's your members that have voted. So then the co-op reps would go out down to the pavement again, trying to get the votes rounded up for whatever side of the argument they were on. The last time we had the referendum to go into federal order, the secretary decided not to reveal the names of the producers who had voted. So, again, maybe discretionary, whether she would or wouldn't, I don't know that. Anybody's guess. So again, then, chapter 62756 said, what do we do if it doesn't pass? Well, then we go back to the pool price calculation that was spelled out in chapter 3.0. So the big takeaway from all of this is that two separate authorities, one in chapter 3 that has the supermajority, if you will, where you have to have at least 65% of the milk or 65% of the producers. There's also authority here in chapter 3.5. 3.5 that only has a 51, 51, 51 easier threshold if you wanted to eliminate quota, and we're able to convince the secretary that you should have a referendum on that issue. So a little bit of something for both sides to think about. If a referendum comes in here, can we make a sound argument the entire chapter should be eliminated, or would we go to chapter 3.0, use that 25% to require both the hearing and the petition? So something for all to think about. And with that.
Thank you, Donald. Okay, so what follows now is a Q&A session. Don and I will sit here. I have a few questions prepared, but all of you should have note cards distributed. If you don't have them, Dino can distribute them to you. If you have a question, please write it down. Please write very clearly. Capital letters preferred, and keep it short. We have small note cards, so you can't ask long questions. And then the questions will be collected, and if Rob and Pete and Francis can help with choosing the ones that you believe are most insightful, and pass them on to me to the stage, and then I'll be asking your questions on your behalf. We are doing it this way to ensure that it's most decorous, respectful to Don and to everyone in the audience, and also the most efficient to get as many questions answered in the next 20 minutes that we have set aside for this. So Don, I just want to start by once more recapping what you said, and I'm going to say it in my words. Please hit me with something if I say something wrong. So there are two different ways to request termination of QIP through a referendum process on behalf of producers to initiate that, right? They can submit a petition that requires 65% of either producers or milk solids to vote to terminate at the referendum, right? If that is the path that the Stop QIP has been pursuing since the start of 2018, they didn't get to a referendum yet because they did not meet the 25% voters threshold on the petition, correct? But if that petition comes in and the signatures are certified as valid, and there are enough of them, then the secretary has no choice. She has to call for a referendum. Is that correct? That is correct. Okay, and then there is another pathway that anybody who wants to terminate QIP can take, and that other pathway is to, are these questions being filtered?
Yeah, I'm jumping the questions here.
Okay, are we not filtering them? We're not, okay. But just to make sure that the best ones make it here. And the co-ops are filtering, not the, and then the second pathway is the pathway that was originally introduced 25 years ago because the fixed spread between the base and overbase That was done through legislation. Producers never voted on it, right? It was imposed upon them. So the legislature opened a back door to reverse it in case people don't like it. And then they say, okay, if you want to do it that way, we're not going to impose the high standard, 65%. We're going to just require that a simple majority affirms it if there's ever a question whether producer community still wants it, right? So that is the second pathway that Donald was explaining. You will often hear it called Chapter 3.5. The second pathway still requires the same number of signatures on the petition, right? 25%. And then the difference is, either petition then has to go to a public hearing. That's the next step. So the secretary has to call for a public hearing, whichever petition comes in, right? And then the major difference is that in the 65% petition, they have to go to a referendum. Here, the secretary can engage in some sort of reasoning whether a referendum should take place, and it's up to her to decide whether a referendum takes place or not. Is that
In 3.5.
in the 51% petition, right? Okay. All right. So I just wanted to summarize that because there's a lot of text and the statute is fairly long. So just so that everybody understands, there are two possible different petitions. One calls for 65%. The second one for 51%. And the second one has a much lower thresholds, but the secretary has the discretion there. So we went, Donald and I did the same conversation yesterday in Ontario. I will repeat some of the questions just so that this audience can hear it as well. This is being recorded, and yesterday was recorded as well, but I will repeat some questions just for the benefit of the audience here. And also some of the questions will be new. So I guess the first question is the one that I did not ask you yesterday, Don. What is a reasonable reading of the legislative intent for authorizing QIP under Chapter 3.5, the same chapter that allows for this lower thresholds? What would be a reasonable reading of the legislative intent? I mean, they could have put it in Chapter 3, which would then eliminate this other pathway, right? You would have to go to 65. They could have created a new chapter, 3.51, right? But the legislator chose to put it in 3.5. What's a reasonable reading behind the legislative intent there?
Assuming, why did they put a whole new chapter as opposed to just incorporating it into 3.0?
In 3.5, why did it 3.5?
So,
Why the QIP was
the quick one. So that the chapter 3.5 was put in as complementary to 3.0, if you will, because it changed the way we were calculating the price. And so, to me, it makes sense to put that there in that chapter 3.5 was an alternative, if you will, of portions of 3.0. So you have the alternative $1.70 spread possibility there. And so now with this separate standalone program, that's an alternative to Chapter 3.0 as well. Yes, legislature could have done whatever they want. Why they chose or why it was put where it was, you could speculate all day long, but at the end of the day, it is where it is, and the code sections say what they say. So it applies the way it's written.
Okay, all right. So, and then in both Chapter 3, in several places, there's this phrase that I kept on finding as I was reading the statute that says that that there's something about effectuating a purpose, that this program has a purpose, the quota has a purpose. And would you be willing to summarize for the audience what does the statute say about the purpose of quota, and if there's anything that the Secretary would consider above and beyond that, now that it's also in Chapter 3.5, whereas the original purpose was explicated in Chapter 3. What's the elevator pitch summary of the purpose?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are multiple chapters that were, according to the legislature, a comprehensive scheme for pricing and pooling. That included Chapter 1, 2, 3, 3.5. And there's some language in multiple chapters that talk about the legislative intent of the state using its police powers to get involved in milk. You'd have to look at the language in both chapters too, where quite a bit of the language is, and then at the front of Chapter 3.5, the the front of 3.5 says something to the effect that the authorities given in chapter 3.0 alone aren't sufficient to make sure that the consumers have an adequate and wholesome supply of milk. And so it would be difficult to summarize, and people are going to read those legislative intents differently. And so if you went into a court of law, depending on what side of an issue you're on, and you wanted to address that legislative intent, you could have a totally different interpretation. So I would say I wouldn't want to try and second guess the legislature. That would be up to folks that are presenting their case before a judge to make that pitch, and what the judge says at the end of the day.
So because of this project, Matt and I spent quite a few days scratching our heads and trying to summarize it in a way that's educational and still unbiased. So I'm going to give you my summary, and please again hit me on the head if I did something wrong. So when we were reading chapter 3, the language that stood out to us as describing the purpose behind pooling is it's a very consumer-centric approach. Stability and adequacy of milk are necessary because milk is a really good thing to drink, really good beverage to drink. So it's necessary for public health of the populace of California. And then we need to engage in police powers, because if we didn't, there would be some untoward behavior, unfair trade practices, and at the end of the day, the public health of the consumers in California would be at jeopardy. Is my summary fair?
Yeah, I would say your summary is fair, and some of that language is in the authority for the federal market administrator, the federal milk market as well. They have to, if you look at their decisions up at the front end of that, it will talk about those same types of issues, the public good, if you will.
Okay. And, just one more question from me, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience. One thing that I noticed is that chapter 3.5 is separate from chapter 3, and it's the chapter 3 that has that famous section that this law will be liberally construed, right? I did not find the same section in chapter 3.5. Should we read anything into that, or is something that's written in chapter 3, if it's not repeated in chapter 3.5, somehow still applies to chapter 3.5 just because they're sort of like the same, headline chapter 3. It's not like it's chapter 98, right? It's the chapter 3 point something. So if something is not repeated again in chapter 3.5, does it carry over from chapter 3? In particular, this liberally construed? That's a section that gives the secretary a wide discretion to interpret the law the way she finds benefits the public good the best. So
the liberally construed, you're right, is in chapter 3.5.
It's in chapter 3.
I'm sorry, chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a much bigger chapter. It talks about the implementation of the plan. It talks about what has to be included, what has to be considered. So there's just a whole lot in there that the legislature, my thinking is they didn't want to get too deep into the weeds, if you will. So they wanted to give the secretary and the industry, as they developed a pool plan, to decide what works best for the industry in implementing and developing that pool plan. Chapter 3.5, very short, very much in the weeds. I don't think they wanted to give the legislature much leeway. If you're going to have this, I'm sorry, Secretary, the legislature did not want to give the secretary much leeway. Said, hey, while this is in place, you are going to have that $1.70 spread. And so, again, I don't think they wanted to give her that leeway.
Okay. Appreciate it. We'll go now to the questions from the audience. So this question, Donald asks about what happens if we have a referendum under the 51% rule, the chapter 3.5. And if that referendum fails to continue to authorize 3.5, so the 3.5 is suspended, the CLIP is terminated, and what happens then? did not eliminate Chapter 3. We still not eliminate the original authorization of the pool. There is still a language in Chapter 3 that says everything is frozen while we have the federal order, but only while we have the federal order. So can you comment on, what would be the consequences of eliminating QIP through the 51% rule, the 3.5, and what does it mean that we still have that Chapter 3 in the background? What is the practical implication?
So with Chapter 3 in the background, the calculation of the quota price was driven entirely by class price revenue. And so in that system, quota price, or the quota milk received all the Class 1 revenue, all of the Class 2 revenue, usually all of Class 3, and then maybe a little bit of Class 4 would be. But if you don't have Chapter 3.5 and you don't have class prices, I don't see any way that you would calculate a price for quota. There's more language in Chapter 3 than what you just referenced. There's a section in there that talks about if a federal order is implemented, then any language that is in conflict with, duplicative of, or unnecessary has to be suspended. And another section that says if a federal order is implemented in California, and I'm paraphrasing here, then the pool plan has to be terminated or suspended. So there's language in there beyond what you just mentioned that would make it problematic to continue the quota program.
So would it be fair to summarize that if you kill QIP to 3.5 to 51%, then it's gone for at least while we have the federal order. And then if at any point in time in the future, for whatever reason, federal order cease to exist here, it is at least theoretically possible that the quota may be resurrected and the pooling program may be resurrected. Is that a...
Yeah, that's fair.
That's fair? Okay. All right. So a question here asked, I believe we covered this already under 3.0, so the 65% referendum. If there is a validated petition, so petition with 25% producers, signatures validated, and if it's asking for termination, does the outcome from the hearing in any way affect whether we go to a referendum or not?
Under 3.5?
3.0.
3.0. No, and it's an interesting bit of language. But by requiring a hearing, at least that gives everybody an opportunity to make a public statement saying, hey, I think it should stay and here's why, or I think it should go and here's why, and put all the information that everybody has, all their opinions and ideas out there in a public forum for all to hear. And then based on that, now we know we're going to referendum. We don't have a choice. Now that we have a referendum, you've heard both sides of the argument. Now cast your vote.
Okay, so we do go to a referendum, full stop. Okay. And I'm going to try to ask this question in the most unbiased way possible, but this was a question that was given to me yesterday or earlier this morning over the phone. Donald, can you here and now guarantee the full privacy of those that do sign a petition? And the reason is that some people may wish to support the cause promulgated by Stop QIP, but they are concerned for the either social or business consequences. For example, they could be a vendor or a business partner of someone who wishes to preserve QIP, and they are afraid if their name comes in public, that they will be denied a business opportunity, that their family will materially suffer. So for them to decide whether to support the petition or not, they would really want to be clear what is the level of protection of their privacy rights. Can you comment on that?
They could make for some very interesting Thanksgiving conversation. No, I cannot guarantee that. At one point, the department had been on record that we would release the names of everybody who signed the petition. But then after some further discussion, the secretary made the decision not to release those names because of the exact concerns that you raised. She did not want the public release of those names to have a chilling effect on anybody that might want to sign that and participate in that process.
So the current decision by the secretary is that the names of the petition signers will never be released. Is that a fair summary?
Nope.
It's not a fair summary.
The fair summary is the last group of names that came in, the secretary decided not to release them. What she would do going forward, she has some flexibility there.
Okay, so thank you for correcting me on that. Okay, so the next question is the one that I asked you yesterday, also in Chino. Last few years we've seen the hearings to affirm 2 Supreme Court justices, Justice Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, and those hearings were very similar. Members of the Senate were trying to ask them, how would you vote as a justice on a particular case, whether it's Roe versus Wade or something else. And they would always say, I'm not going to prejudicate, I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to vote in a particular case, but I'm going to tell you which principles I use in decision making, right? So as you and I were talking on the phone in preparation for these meetings this week, you told me you're not going to speculate how the department may decide on a particular petition coming in. But I'm hoping that you can offer some insight on the first principles that the department will use to arrive at the decision whether to hold a referendum on some petition or that arrives at the 3.5. So just some general principles that you will use to arrive in a principled way to that decision whether to go to a referendum or not.
So that petition would have to seek the suspension of the entirety of Chapter 3.5, not just the quip. And so if you were to submit that petition under 3.5, when we went to the hearing process, it would be incumbent upon you to make the argument as to why the entire chapter needs to be suspended and come with some good legal arguments, economically sound arguments, legally sound arguments. There's no one magic buzzword that you can put in there. You just have to make a good argument as to why, again, it's in the entirety, not that we just don't like this one down here, but we want the entire chapter.
Okay, so actually, I'm glad you said that because the follow-up question here from the audience talks about, the petition in Chapter 3.5 was originally, that pathway was introduced in case people don't like the fixed spread between the base and the overbase, right? And there could be a varied factors why that may not be good for the producer community or a subset of producer community. So if an argument was made that going forward, the fixed spread, the $1.70, because, for example, of declining fluid milk sales that we've seen last few years and going into 2020s, that fixed spread does no longer is no longer balanced between those that pay and those that receive monies. Would that be considered as sufficient, as applicable to the Chapter 3.5? In a sense, people don't, if the argument was made not about the standalone quota, but if the argument in the testimony was focused on the fixed spread, and basically quota was a collateral, the quip was a collateral damage of any referendum outcome, right? But if the argument was focused on the fixed spread in conjunction with fluid milk sales, for example, would that be considered something that speaks to the purpose of the petition under Chapter 3.5 and the reason it was there, and would it be considered sufficient? Perhaps it's a too specific question for you to say.
Yeah, it's a little too specific.
Yeah, too specific, okay. Yeah. I'm just reading the questions I received. Okay. Oh yeah, and then this is the question that I asked you yesterday. I didn't mean to ask you again, but there is a lot of interest here. The question reads, I'm going to read it verbatim. If the quip is terminated, will anyone at CDFA be laid off?
No. The layoffs occurred when we transitioned from the state system to the federal order. So we had about 40 staff that were given layoff notices. A number of those were moved around within the department. There were quite a few that did leave the department. The federal order, the market administrator was very pleased to get a good number of our audit staff to jump over and are now auditing in the federal order system. That shaved probably I would say at least a year off the learning curve of training an auditor about milk math and milk terms and just what to look for and receipts and usage and so forth. So had about 15 people go over there. Right now, we only have 5 people that deal with the equip, myself and 4 staff. One thing that in this last round of budget, or of legislation, there was authority granted to hire some additional staff to oversee the producer security trust fund. And so, depending on timing and whatnot, if QUIP were to go away, say, in March, I have 2 auditors. They could just transition over into the positions that were authorized under the trust fund. I have a staff service analyst. There's always open or vacant positions in the department as a staff service analyst. And the same with my research analyst. There's always vacancies around within the department. So it's easy to place 5 people within the department. It wasn't so easy with 40 people.
I will close with the next question. We do need to move on. We are now hour 15 into today's meeting. This is going to be my interpretation and summary of a few questions here. The best and the worst case scenario in terms of the length to resolution, to some sort of final stability. If you can comment on feasibility and maybe drawing on experiences from some other sectors. So the best case scenario in terms of time to resolution, would it be fair to say that that's the producer to community to come to a consensus at the end of this process, call Secretary Ross, ask for a meeting and say, we believe there's a widespread interest in the community to promulgate this particular solution. Is there a pathway where she can do that at that point without even a referendum, but just either fiat or working with the governor's office to implement that through legislation, assuming that the proposed solution is not contested from anyone within the industry, but there's a coalescence, consensus about it. Is that something that's even feasible, conceivable?
So the timing issue, if you go to legislation, the earliest legislation most likely would be effective at this point would be January 1 of 2021, because we've already missed the deadline for any language or any legislative changes to be effective January 1 of 2020. So that puts you well down the road. If it's an administrative change, then we can move fairly quickly through the administrative process. But it's incumbent upon the industry to move as quick as possible, right. as was mentioned at the meeting yesterday.
Yeah, okay. And then, the worst case scenario, let's say that the people don't reach a consensus and that there are 2 sides and they, the petition is filed and you go through a public hearing and then you make a decision. I'm not going to ask you what decision it is, but you make a decision. One side challenges it through legal means, and it ends up in court. Based on maybe what you heard happening in other sectors or other lawsuits that the department was involved in, what is a reasonable timeline for a lawsuit to be adjudicated and to reach? Are we talking about 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, 2 decades? What's a span of reasonable expectations for a lawsuit to be settled? Oh, not settled, but reach a final verdict.
So I'm looking at Chip for guidance. So I would say it depends on the decision and what the petition, what the lawsuit asks for. If you're asking for an injunction, the time frame could be much shorter than some of the lawsuits that we've gone through over the years. Some of them drag on for a couple years.
A couple of years being 2 years? Or?
Yeah. I would say 2, 3, Chip. 1 finger, 2 finger, 3 finger for a year. Three
blinking fingers.
3 blinking fingers. So yeah, it just depends again based what the lawsuit asks.
Okay. All right. Some of the questions I didn't read. If you believe that the question should be asked, nevertheless, find me in the break. Help me read your note, and I will ask it tomorrow. Then. Thank you all for your time, and could you please join me in thanking you all. All right. Okay. So at this point.
It's a brain trust. Ask the question. It's a brain trust episode. So you just get off with the best It's always I'm sure. Yeah, that was a my brother will go off and tell me about it, but step it up, right? I was amazed. I had no and I learned we're going to take this. Hello? Morning? Can everyone return to their seats? The next section's on. You feel bad. Oh! How are you? Okay, so on your tables, there is a feedback booklet. This is an anonymous survey that we are using to take what you heard today and your preferences on what's going to go to phase 3. So this is really, really important that you participate and give us your feedback using this. So on the front page, it's asking you, are you California grade A milk producer? Yes, please continue. No, please just sit tight and listen, but don't do anything with the survey. On the next page, which is marked as page 1, if you take just a few moments to enter just a very brief demographics about yourself, how many cows you're milking, total shipments in 2019 anticipated, county or counties where you operate, percent of milk covered by quota, when was it acquired? You can be approximate there, we're not asking up to a pound. And do you plan to retire and sell out, or are you sticking in for a long haul? There is also an online version of this, if you're so inclined, on your phone. You can go to surveymonkey.com
slash letter R is Richard, slash again quota phase 2 survey. This is going to be online as well. So if you don't have a chance today to submit your survey, you can do it also on the dairyfamilies.org. This link will be up there. Also, if you don't feel you had enough time today to hear everything, we'll do a webinar on Monday morning. That's going to be the last opportunity to visit, unless you want to come to Tulare with us tomorrow. Okay, so please follow along with the survey booklet. I want to just remind everyone of what our charge is and what it is not. So in phase 1, we were gathering input from the community. We were meeting here in July, and we were doing a bunch of one-on-one conversations with a number of you and your representatives and industries, supporting industries, etc. We are now in phase 2. The first thing we had to do is to take what we heard and to write it up. We did that. You have about 40 pages. You can read online. If you ever suffer from insomnia, I recommend a few of those. So then we're here to present options. Not all of these options are super smart options, if you will. Whenever you do brainstorming, you hope to generate 10 ideas, not more of 7 of which are going to be stupid, right? So we are giving you some really left of field, right of field ideas here, as well as those that may be more mainstream. There will be certainly ideas that we will present in the next hour and a half that will make you outraged. If we don't achieve that, then I will have failed, because I need to give you options, all kinds of options, right? But if you hear an idea that you're strongly object, the survey is the appropriate way to note that. Note it there, offer comments below. Use the time, we'll have a Q&A. Use the time to learn about the proposals you like, more than to try to convince your fellow dairymen about the demerits of something that you dislike. There'll be regional committee meetings to do that, and let everyone make their own mind today. And Matt and I will not know what the final 3 ideas are until the advisory committee give us their charge on December 1. So there's still a full month to have the conversations within the industry, to reread the memos, watch the videos. Everything is being recorded. You're recording this as well? Yeah, okay. So everything is being recorded. You'll have a chance to revisit this. What we want, and Matt and I really don't have any stake in the game here in terms of one particular solution or another. We just want you to make informed decision, understand the consequences, understand the legal constraints and pathways, and we just spent an hour doing that with Don. And then finally, we want to the maximum extent possible, include all of you in the decision making. So it's not just 5 people in a room deciding your fate, so that you all are included as to the maximum extent feasible. At this stage, it is still feasible. That's why we have surveys. And we will use your answers to trim this down from 11 ideas you'll hear today down to 3. And then in phase 3, when we come back, Dino mentioned that we'll be done by January 15th. We'll be done way before that. We'll be done before the end of the year. So if you guys want to meet in early January, I'm sure that the weather here is going to be better than Minnesota. I'm very happy to be here. So, and then, if needed, we can also work with you to move into the implementation phase. One apology why we are late. We were supposed to have these meetings in September. This little kid happened on September 9th. You can see how big he is from the size of my hand here. And so, anyway, I'm a father now. Who knew? My promise to you is that my wife is not pregnant again, and I have no other women that I've inseminated since. So there will be no other delays for the phase 3 meetings in January. So this is what you told us in phase 1. We took all 1,500 cards that you gave to Matt and I. We coded all of them, and this is the word map that came about as a consequence. I know that this is not pleasurable from way back in the room. Quota, buyout, time, value, assessments, years, should, sunset, some of the words that stand tax, needs, environmental, etc. So a lot of thoughts put into phase 1 meeting. I'm really proud of your engagement and the input that you provided us with. Now is the time to start trimming down those ideas, not expand the field further, but to start going down. And I want to start by hope for final outcome. Once we're done with phase 2, once we're done with phase 3, when we go down to one idea, it will have to be fine-tuned, and then finally the solution will have to be negotiated. So if you hope to achieve a consensus, these are just my thoughts, this is not vetted by COPS or StopWhip or Dino and their families, but I would say that there are 4 prerequisites for a consensus solution. First, at the end of the day, at the end of the process, you will have to have credible leaders with powers to negotiate. And then you will have to have protocols for legitimizing whatever solution is negotiated. Dino said yesterday in China that we are now here today, that this is phase of negotiations. We are negotiating down from 10 to 3. You can see it that way. But at the end of the process, there will have to be a tight group of people with powers to fine-tune that final idea into a fully worked-through solution. You have to have some sort of credible deadline. Nothing ever gets done if we can keep on talking. So I'm not the one setting deadlines here, but I implore the group, all stakeholders involved, to agree on the deadline, and Matt and I will do everything humanly possible to work with your deadlines. Then you have to have substantially similar assessments of risk. This is not just an academic phrase there. If there's one group of dairymen in this room that thinks, okay, well, we just really don't need to do anything. Okay, so what can they do? They can put in a petition for 65, that's going to fail. They can put in a petition for 51. These dairymen, in my thought experiment, may think, that's not going to get to a referendum, we just don't need to do anything. So if your opinion is that the alternative to negotiating a consensus is that nothing happens, you will not have the incentive to pursue a consensus. You just heard that today. Don't take the discretion to mean nothing is going to happen. The department is going to go through a deliberate process of deciding if there is a 51% petition. They're going to go through a deliberate process of deciding whether that merits referendum or not. But that's not a 0 probability event, just as it's not a 100% probability event. If you don't take into account these risks, you will be less motivated to seek a consensus, you will be more motivated to pursue your individual solutions, and then we will not have a consensus. So learn about the risks. And then finally, whatever consensus solution is found has to be legally feasible and agreeable to CDFA, especially if you want CDFA as a partner either to implement it to a referendum or to have it smooth sailing through the legislature if that's the nature of the consensus solution. And also to remind everybody of the risk or where the votes are right now. You may recall a slide similar to this one from July. We have 2 different petition pathways here, the 65% pathway and the 51% pathway, which is really 49.1% pathway. That's the red line here is the chapter 3.5, the 49.1, this is 65. Based on every data that we got from Donald, from CDFA, we estimated that if the vote was today to eliminate quit, and if people were just voting based on their narrowly defined economic interests, cash flow basis, that the vote would be somewhere between here and here. This is in terms of milk solids. So you can see that over the last decade, the votes were there to go for the 65. We are now, we're not sure where they are, whether they're here or here. You can't tell precisely from the data. But and the reason it's been going down a little bit because the production in California has been shrinking last few years. Now it's growing again. So it probably this is moving up. So if we have a 65% petition, it's going to be tight. It's going to be uncertain. But you can be certain that there will be a referendum. Donald just confirmed it, not my interpretation, his words, on behalf of CDFA. If a petition for 51% is put in, the votes are not really in question. It is very likely that such a referendum would lead to termination. What is not certain there is whether there will be a referendum or not. But not certain, again, doesn't mean there is no possibility of that. So whether you subscribe to this as the alternative to a consensus or this as an alternative to a consensus, there are risks. So there are strong reasons to pay attention to these 11 ideas today and to think through what may be acceptable, not just to you, but also to the other side, whichever side you're on. What may be acceptable to a wide community of producers. So with that, enough with the prerequisites, preliminaries, let's dig into some proposals. So we've organized today's meeting into 3 sessions. In the first session, we will go through 3 ideas, each of which seeks to preserve QUIP. So not terminate QUIP, but preserve QUIP, maybe in modified form. In the second session, we'll go through the 3 ideas that seek to buy out the quota, compensate quota holders, and then the QUIP goes away. And then in the last session, we will go through termination and sunset. So those are the ideas that seek to terminate QUIP. So preserve, buy out, and terminate, those are the themes of these 3 sessions. So because there's a lot of material to go through, I won't be the only one speaking like in July. And also Matt will lead us through about half of these. And Matt will now hit the stage with explaining to us the first of these proposals. You will find that proposal on page 3. So we'll come back to page 2. It's a little bit out of order. Page 3, document K, changing regional quota adjusters. Matt, the floor is yours.
Morning. We're now going to shift more into a workshop type of mode. The way that this is going to work is that Maren and I are going to trade off presenting ideas, and then at the end of each of our short little talks, they should average around 5 minutes, you'll give your feedback either in these forms with the corresponding page. So as he said, this is page 3, this is document K. And then we'll move on to the next one. After we cover 3 ideas, then we'll take questions. So we're starting with maybe not the most interesting idea, but it's a foundational idea for the rest of the ideas that we talk about, changing regional quota adjusters. So when we went out in our listing tour in July, oh, I'm sorry. I don't. So when we came out in July, one of the most popular ideas in every region that we went to was this idea of changing regional quota adjusters. So currently, depending on where you are in the state, you have if you're a quota holder, you have a different, you get paid differently for quota. If you're in Southern California, you get about $1.70 per hundredweight, and if you're in, say, Kings County, you get $1.43. This was originally created as a way to value milk differently in the state and give it a regional valuation. When we got the federal order, we started to get something that looked a bit like a redundancy. So in the federal order, they value milk differently in using Class 1 differentials. So this was why a popular idea was, well, we should change regional quota adjusters and make them all $1.43, so that no matter where you were in the state, everyone would get treated fairly or equally with quota. If you were to do that, it would reduce the assessment by 3 cents. So on average, the assessments for quota for QUIP is about 37 cents over a long period of time. That if you lowered everyone's using the regional quota adjusters, everyone would be at $1.43, and it would go from, say, 37 cents on average to 34. But the other important reason why we want to start with regional quota adjusters is because no matter the policy idea, whether that's, well, I suppose you could have a sunset termination or a phase-out termination or whatever flavor that you come up with, if you want to amend or dissolve quota over some period of time, you can use RQAs. So if, for example, you want to have a 10-year phase-out, well, then you can take the RQAs and you can adjust them so that every 10 years, well, say you start out at $1.43, et cetera, you decrease each year. So we'll get into those ideas later. Just the first idea that we're starting with is changing regional quota adjusters, and that's the first proposal.
So as Matt said, we will hold your questions until we go through the first 3 ideas, and then we'll have a block Q&A, plenty of time for all your questions.
Answer the question, sorry.
Yes, and then now take a moment, a minute or minute and a half, to read through the top of the document K page, page 3. There's a brief summary of the idea there, and then it's asking you a few questions. Some of them are multiple choice, some of them are open-ended. So for all of these proposals, we're going to ask you very similar questions. Is it fair? Is it easy to understand? And would you vote to support it if this was on a referendum? And then, how can this proposal be made better? And if you have other comments. So I'm going to give you some time to go through that now. All right. So going back to page 2 of the survey booklet, going back to document I, which is tying quota payments to Class 1 sales. Okay, so online you can read a full-page memo, full 3-4 page memo on what we forecast will happen over the next decade in California. And part of our forecast is that the fluid milk consumption is going to keep on declining. So for the last 30 years, the per capita consumption of fluid milk has been trending down. But the population in California has been growing, and for a long period of time, it was able to compensate for lower consumption per person. Sometimes, at the turn of this decade, the consumption per capita started dropping too fast for population size to catch up, to compensate. And then the total Class 1 sales started going down. So we were close to 8 billion pounds here at the turn of the century, and for a long period of time, we anticipate by the end of the decade, next decade, 2030, we will be below 5 billion pounds in Class 1, in fluid milk consumption in California. So quite a substantial decrease of over 20%. So this proposal calls for tying quota payments, again, to some extent, like it was before, to Class 1 milk sales. Now, to be clear, quota was always motivated by Class 1, by fluid milk sales, but it was never exactly tied just to Class 1 sales. So I don't mean to revisit the past, but I'm using that core idea to motivate one potential pathway for reform going forward. So how would we do this? Every month, California Federal Order reports the total sales of Class 1 pounds pooled on the federal order, and they provide information from which we can infer where are the relative importance or the weighted average across all plants in the state. So there's something called Class 1 differentials, which is the surcharge that a fluid milk plant has to pay above the, I'm going to call it opportunity cost of milk. So if that milk wasn't used in the fluid milk plant, if there was capacity in both powder and cheese plants, the next best use of that milk at the time when they were making a decision whether to go to fluid or not. I'm being somewhat imprecise and incorrect here, but I'm trying to build your intuition for what Class 1 differential stands for. So anyway, what we would do here is we would take all of that pool of money contributed from the Class 1 sales. When we value the additional contribution of Class 1 sales, by the class 1 differentials. And what ends up happening if you do that? Instead of 12 million pounds, instead of $12 million that you collect in QUIP assessments every month, you go down to somewhere between 8 and 9 million, depending on the month, seasonality, etc. And if you just take that money and distribute to quota holders, you end up with a quota pay prices, quota differentials of about $1.08, $1.10, somewhere thereabouts. If you were on the other side, if you're paying the assessments for QUIP, you're currently paying 37, 34, 35, like it's somewhere there. It would go down to about 26 cents per hundredweight of standard milk. So both the quota payments and the assessments would go down by about a third. Not quite, but thereabouts. One important thing to notice here is that the reason we ended up with a fixed differential in the 90s is because when prices got volatile, there were actually months, some of you may remember, in late 80s, early 90s, there were months where the quota pay prices were negative. And that happens when the manufacturing prices suddenly rally. And then the manufacturing prices end up being higher than the class 1 prices. Under this formula, that would never happen. Under the way that we designed, the quota payments would be fairly stable from month to month, from year to year. Of course, it would share the fate, it would share the destiny of the class 1 sales. So if the class 1 sales in the state rebound and start going up, the quota payments will also go up. But if the class 1 sales continue to go down, the quota payments would also go down, the assessments would go down as well. So in this proposal, this is the first example of using RQAs for something more than just regional differentiation of value of milk. In this case, we are instead of having RQAs being a constant number, like if you read QUIP today, they implementing the relation, for each zone there is a RQA that says it's negative so-and-so. Like, for example, in Tulare it's negative 27 cents per hundredweight of standard milk. They express it in pounds of solids on fat. I'm just translating to make it more intuitive. So here, we would say you can do this without going to the legislature if you make RQAs be a formula that takes as an input how much fluid milk was sold, passes it through our conversion mechanism, and then on the other side tells you, okay, this is how much each pound of quota has to be paid this month. It doesn't have to be volatile month to month. You can make this smooth by saying, we'll use the 12-month moving average, right? And there are, of course, other ways to calculate the contributions of class 1. I personally like this one for theoretical reasons, for economic reasons. It's also for the stability it provides, predictability from month to month. There are no wild swings there. If you were to do this proposal, you can do it either as a standalone, or this can become a part of anything else that you negotiate. If you start negotiating a sunset, you can make this be a part of the sunset. And you'll see some other examples down through the program today. Okay, so if you were to do this, and if the fluid milk sales declined by 2% each year, then over the next 5 years, for each pound of quota, you will be paid $218. Over the next 10 years, you will be paid over $400. You may ask, well, if we implement this, what's the present value of this program? Well, if this program was only to go for 5 years and then discontinued, the present value would be $193 per pound of quota. If it were to go for 7 years, you would end up with 254, and then etc. So if this were to go forever, then of course the value of quota would approach almost $1,000 or so, like $800 or so. But you can see from this table what is the total present value of this program if it were to also discontinue after a point in time. So we gave you just different ways to think about it. So if you want to take a moment now, and on the survey, page 2, there is again a summary on the top that repeats what I just said. We would tie the quota payments to class 1 sales. What that would mean in practice is that quota payments would decline to about $1.08 per hundredweight. Assessments would decline to 26 cents per hundredweight. We are asking you the same questions as before. Is it fair? Is it easy to understand? Would you vote for it if this was on our referendum? What do you like about it? How can we make it better? And there are other comments as well. There was a question yesterday in Chino to share the way we calculated this. So we'll oblige with that. We'll provide an Excel file with some examples. We can put it online together with other memos. Full transparency, that's our promise to you. So take a moment to go through this, and then Matt is going to take us through the third idea. Now the third idea particularly has the potential to elicit some strong emotions from you. And I again want to remind you that it was our charge to give you options from one end of the spectrum to another. And this is an idea that is within that mission. Whether it makes it to the top 3 or not, it's entirely up to you.
All right, the third proposal, so this is the third of 3, and so after we're done with this, we're going to take questions on the last 3 that we did. So you're going to fill out the form, and then we're going to take questions, and then we'll move on to the next. This proposal is probably the quintessential proposal for preserving QUIP in its existing form without making any significant amendments either through the legislature or through a referendum. And so as Marin said, part of our charge was our charge was to evaluate all the options that you could preserve it, amend it, or dissolve it that would result in a stable outcome. So this is our investigation of what we found was available to the producer community to stabilize QUIP. In this proposal, we are talking about solutions that do not have to be implemented through the legislature, that they can be implemented through the producer community. So I want to emphasize that the legislature would not be involved. So the first there's 2 parts to this. The first idea of stabilizing QUIP is to create a quota cooperative. So quota is currently very close, or maybe arguably already is, politically unstable. At the 65% threshold, we're very close. I think we calculate that as much as 64.9% of the milk solids in the state as of the end of October were net payers into the QUIP. And so depending on voter turnout and who votes and who doesn't, at a 65% referendum, it is our assessment that the program could terminate, or at least would be at strong risk of termination today. So one solution to resolve that would be to redistribute quota, so that instead of being at 64.9%, that the community can assess, the producer community can assess that we are not at a place that is close to termination. And so our means for doing that, our way of trying to redistribute quota, is creating a quota co-op. And the way that the quota co-op would work is that in the industry, quota holders would come together and under a binding contract agree that if a certain percentage of other quota holders agreed, they'd enter into this co-op. And then the co-op would have a fair, algorithmic, likely to some degree random or independent algorithm that would redistribute quota to the producers that would be, I don't know how to quite put it, the least expensive to make economically incentivized to keep quota. So if you could give quota to small producers, and so one of the ways that the program is stable, or that the votes is based on number of producers. So if you increase the number of small producers that are quota owners, net receivers from the program, well then that's one way. Or you redistribute quota to producers that were very close to that threshold of being beneficiaries of the net beneficiaries, the net payers, and they could be very, that you can, with a small amount of quota, move them into being net receivers from the program. The cost to do that, we estimate, would be about $90 million in order to secure and be sure that the cost isn't necessarily the amount of quota that have to be redistributed. We're told about $90 million to make sure that you didn't hit that 65% threshold. If you wanted to secure quota all the way down to the 51% or 49.1%, it would cost just under 500, or you'd have to redistribute something like $500 million worth of quota. So that's probably not the most likely outcome that you could get the industry to agree to redistribute $500 million worth of quota, but the numbers are the numbers. The other way that you could seek to stabilize the quota system would be to try to convince current non-quota holders to go grade B. So about 36% of the milk supply in the state does not own quota. And so if you can move them, those are clear no votes, they want to terminate quota, if you could move them from being no votes to being grade B and not having a vote, that of course would stabilize the system. Currently, there isn't much interest among the manufacturers for that idea. That is a wildly unpopular idea. Talking to the manufacturers, the feedback that we received is, oh, there's all kinds of negative problems. One, California, if you keep growing the grade B supply, California is going to get branded as having dirtier milk, for example, or it creates all kinds of downstream effects. For example, if you produce grade B milk and you get grade B whey, well then your whey can't have a grade A claim. And among the manufacturers, they said quota currently is a producer issue, and if you go down the path of growing grade B production, well now it becomes a manufacturer issue too. But that's, if we're going to do our jobs to investigate all the different ways that you could go about this, one way which you could seek to stabilize quota would be to grow grade B production in the state. And then lastly, I just want to wrap up with, in this proposal, in our proposals to try to stabilize QUIP, we came up with solutions that you could stabilize QUIP from the 65% threshold, possibly, I suppose, for the 51% threshold. We did not we could not come up with a solution to stabilize QUIP from any changes from judicial challenge. So if it goes to court, the courts can ultimately decide that the QUIP should no longer exist. And even if you created a quota co-op, it would not be insulated from that risk. And if the legislature voted out QUIP, it still wouldn't be insulated from that. So in our quota stabilization proposal, we're proposing to stabilize QUIP from the referendum process. So that's kind of the wrap up of that. So if you could please write your feedback in the booklets, and then we will take questions after everyone's had time to put in their feedback.
All right, so now is the time to ask questions on any of these three proposals. On equalizing RQAs, on tying quota payments to fluid milk sales, or on quota stabilization through comparative or grade B. We have set aside 15 minutes for questions on this, so we want to make sure we don't have to use all 15. But what I'm trying to say is we can have a thorough discussion if you have a lot of questions. If you don't, we'll just move on. Yes, please.
Wouldn't the grade B option also have a destabilizing effect as well? Suppose the neutral level would move up as the grade B level moved up as well too, right? So if you were net neutral and we did have a migration to grade B, you would no longer be net neutral. Correct?
That is correct, but the net effect would still be that it will be harder to reach the 65% threshold. There is another aspect of it, however. If you are currently just barely cash flow positive from quota, and you believe that there is a chance that more milk is going to go grade B, then when we later talk about termination referendum, that may also affect your vote, because you will take into consideration not just your current cash flow, but your potential risk to your cash flow going forward. So it gets complicated, but all things considered, if a lot of milk that is currently doesn't own quota moves to grade B, it will be harder to reach that 65% threshold of those that remain grade A. Yes, sir.
So, how much grade B milk was being produced before the federal order started? And has that moved up, and where are we at now? And what is the palatability of the buyers, not just the co-ops and sort of process it, or the independents, Leprino, Hillmark, but the marketability of now grade B milk out of California when we have a standard of having grade A for our worldwide exports? What does that do to our industry? Oh, now there's a bunch of grade B guys out there.
Yeah, it's as Matt said before, a lot of negative problems with grade B. So, yeah, he can take that, but do you know the numbers?
Yeah. So as of January, or well, I guess June was the data. 4.3% of the milk supply in California was grade B.
In this year?
This year.
How much?
4.3%. And then below, before the federal order, I think it was 2.7. Yeah, something
Less
like
than
that.
3%.
So we did have a substantial increase. What is the palatability of it? I mean, this grade B issue has been a lightning rod for among the processor community is something that among the processors that we spoke to in this process was not viewed favorably. But that said, there's still room. There's still plenty of room that it could grow. But I guess the short answer is that it's not an outcome that's necessarily desired by the processors, but that because of the incentives in place and the ability to switch to grade B once per year at the start of the year, and that's a producer power. So.
If I can add, just so that there's no ambiguities there. Would I be happier with a consensus solution that doesn't go that way? Yes, I would. I think that for you as an industry, taking consideration all the producers, all the processors, together as a California industry, if you can find a solution that doesn't take us to grade B, you'll be better off. But this particular proposal is narrowly focused on just trying to stabilize quota. In that mission, we discount other factors. But yes, taking into consideration everything else, I bet that there are some grade B producers. I actually know of a few grade B shippers today who are very active in providing input to us because they perhaps don't want to be grade B shippers. They would like to be grade A shippers, but they're grade B shippers just because the system incentivizes them that way. Grade B is not a desirable solution in its own right. I would hope to have more questions now on the first two proposals, the equalized RQA or the tying quota to fluid milk. Yes?
I have a question. The proposal to tie quota back to fluid milk, and then it would reduce it by 20 cents, or the table would be reduced by a few cents, and the payment received would be reduced. But if that's the case, have we been paying too much over the last couple of years? I know maybe that's not where we're going to go, but it seems to me like we're talking about kind of that. How much has been over? Or I guess maybe none has been over. I don't know if you answered that question.
Yeah. So all the payments that are up to a cent that were made to Quip are approved by the statute and the implementing regulation and on a referendum in 2018. So I don't think it's helpful to talk about the past in terms of doing something over or under, because you were always playing by the rules that were in place at that time. My recommendation to the community would be to stay focused on looking forward, and looking forward, if you wanted the payments of quota to be strictly tied to Class 1 sales, this is the way to do it. At this point, they're not strictly based on Class 1 sales, so therefore it is up to you to make the case whether comparing that with Class 1 sales in the past is an appropriate benchmark or not. I'm not going to use this stage to do that.
Martin, you're going to have to repeat the question. We couldn't hear.
The question was, from the fact that I just said that if we move quota payments to Class 1 sales, that it would drop the assessments down to 26 cents and the quota payments to $1.08, does it follow that at this present point in time, you're overpaying for quota? And my answer was that at this present point in time, you're paying for quota based on the current rules that are not strictly tying quota to Class 1 sales. So the benchmark depends on what you consider the program, what is the program purpose, I guess, if you will. But it would take us much more than the remaining hour and a half that we have here to relitigate the previous 50 years of quota history. That time is much better used to contemplate pathways going forward. So I'm going to respectfully ask that we stay focused on looking forward rather than looking backwards. Yes, sir.
Document 1, time payments to the Class 1, your example of the dollar average. That's an average, so I'm assuming we're still going to have the regional differences, so guys are going to get more in the dollars.
In the way that we've designed this proposal, and I believe we had a chart there as well. Okay, so to restate the question was whether there will still be regional differences in monies received for quota certificate per pound. And the answer is no. This particular proposal, the way we constructed it currently, assumes that a quota certificate gives you the same amount of money whether you're in Tulare or Petaluma or Bakersfield or anywhere. Yes, sir.
Kind of going along with this chart here. So this plan and the reducing R2As and tying it to Class 1 could also theoretically be done in conjunction with like a sunset or a retirement.
Absolutely, yes. So the way we are presenting it as a standalone to initiate the conversation, but as Dina said at the beginning of this meeting today and yesterday, these are not set in stones. You can take these sort of as crayons and start painting your own picture, combining them, anything that you need to craft the consensus. Yes. Further questions? Yes, sir.
In the first one about changing the RQAs, everything to $1.43, and it said that the assessment would decrease by about 3 cents a hundredweight because you're dropping everybody to the lowest value. What would the numbers be if you put everybody at the full $1.70, or if you like weighted average it out or something like that?
43 cents.
43 cents higher? Yeah. So yeah, if you oh, the assessments would go down by 6 cents. So the question was, instead of bringing everyone down to Tulare, what if we brought Tulare and others up to the Zone 1? The assessments would go up in that case, and they would go up by 6 cents.
What about the level of the current assessment that's getting collected now? What would the payout be if the same amount was collected, but the RQAs were gone and everybody was at the same level? The quota payment.
No, I don't think so. I think that they're asking how much, what if we had to choose a single RQA for all zones with the money that's currently being collected? I think that's about $1.54, I guess, because that's the weighted average quota payment. So yes. Good questions, guys. Good questions. Chip.
Yesterday you said this on your own, but I think you raised yesterday the question of a legal issue with respect to the cooperative proposal.
That is correct. So let me thank you for reminding me of that. So for all of these proposals, but in particular with quota stabilization, if the community prefers that we take this to the phase 3, part of our mission in phase 3 would be to thoroughly examine whether this is legal. Quota stabilization may seem like an attractive solution to those that wish to preserve quip, but we did not examine at this stage whether that would violate any antitrust laws or collusion, cartels, etc. That would be something that we would need still to examine going forward. So don't take from this, from our proposal, the assumption that, oh yeah, we can do that, it's all clear with the law. That was something that we would need to examine. We're good on time if there are more questions. All right, hearing none. Yep, one more question.
Just a quick clarification. If we decide to go with one of these plans, will that do away with the referendum?
So what is important is that whatever plan is decided on is something that is agreeable to the community of producers that are currently pursuing the petition. So if only quota holders say, yeah, we like this, let's go with that, while you have not satisfied the other side, if you will. So the consensus means that you put on the table something that is a better deal than submitting the petition, right? So that's why the consensus means that it works for the quota holders, but it also works for the stockholder. And I cannot speak on their behalf. So at this stage in the process, we go down from 10 to 3, and those 3 would then, among those 3 would have to be something that is a more attractive deal than going for petition. There, just like I tried to convince all of you here that if you own quota, you should engage with the other side. So goes for stop quip. It is, if they go with 65%, it's not clear they're going to win. If they go with 51%, it's not clear they're going to get the referendum. They also have the incentive to negotiate with the quota holders. But in theory of negotiations, there's something called best alternative to negotiate an agreement. If the proposal on the table is, I'm going to use a ridiculous example just so that I don't nudge anybody. If the best that the one side is going to say, well, a 50-year sunset, what do you think is the other side is going to go? They will say 50-year sunset or a likelihood of a lawsuit that takes 3-4 years. Well, maybe a lawsuit is better, right? So you have to propose something that makes sense, but it also is a better deal than a risky alternative to consensus. Thank you very much. We're good on time. If there are more questions?
No, I don't think you're good on time. It's 20 after, it's 20 after 12.
I run this
2 more
meeting.
sections.
It's very important that you have time to contemplate this and ask questions. So if we run over by 10 minutes, that's fine. I'm not going to be back until January, so now is the time to take this discussion. Okay, hearing no questions, we'll move now to session 2. 3 proposals on buying out the quota. So in one way or another, compensating quota holders for the quota they have as part of the process of doing away with the system. And Matt is going to take us through the proposal H, which we call simple bond.
Okay, so the simple bond was also one of the most popular ideas that came out of the meetings that we had. And a simple bond is pretty straightforward. A bond is just an IOU, so a simple bond is all the quota holders get paid out a cash payment, and then the industry agrees to pay back that money over a period of time via an assessment. In concept, it's not all that difficult to understand because it's very similar to a municipal bond. You have an investor that wants to buy the bond, and then you have somebody who has to pay them back. The challenge with the bond is that is in the details, and so I'm going to walk through how a bond would actually have to be implemented. The first thing is that for a bond, a simple bond to happen, is you have to get the backing of the state. So the state would have to say, well, if the dairy industry did not pay back the bond, that we would vouch and pay back the bond. They'd work with a bank like a Goldman Sachs, and for somewhere between 2 and 5%, that's what it was previously estimated would cost to issue a bond. And then through the legislature, you'd have to change a number of things. No one would want to agree to provide a bond to the industry if they thought that the industry could just back out. You know, the money gets paid to the producers, and then the producers say, oh, actually, we don't want this anymore, we're going to terminate it via referendum, and now we don't have to pay back the assessments. So you'd have to go through the legislature, and you'd have to change a number of those rules to make things permanent. But also, if you're going to get the backing of the state, well, then you have to make it through the various finance committees, because the state is taking on the liability on behalf of the industry. If you guys look at the memos online, this is how we have a number of different charts in there to show, well, how much money would get paid out if these were the arrangements. So here, I structured this chart the same way, at an interest rate of, interest rate of 5%. That's what the bank, whatever, will be asking for. There's a lot of, that number can move around a lot depending on how permanent it was, or the insurance that the bond was low risk. And then the industry would agree to an assessment for a duration of time. So if the industry agreed to an assessment of, say, 20 cents for, say, 30 years, that would work out to a cash payment today of $552. When this chart was originally put together, it was put together a month or two ago. At market prices, that's what green is, everything that was above market prices, and so that would incentivize people who own quota to want to agree to the bond because they could get a better deal. And so you can kind of work through whatever number you have in your mind is a fair price. What would that look like? You know, if we had an assessment for 15 cents, you know, you have to be 15 years to get to $270. You can kind of work through what that would look like. Just want to emphasize a few things. If you went down the bond route, you would have to do a number of things through the legislature to amend the QIP provisions so that nobody could opt out, that the industry would pay back the assessments. And that I want to emphasize, in order to receive backing from the state government would have to agree to a financial liability, which means you'd have to make it through the different finance and budget committees. So that's the simple bond. Kind of to summarize, it was the most popular, or one of the most popular ideas of the first phase of meetings. From a high level, it makes a lot of sense, but then when you get into the details, there are some challenges. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Maren for the next idea. Well, hold on. Please fill out your whole comment box.
Okay, so before we move on, I just want to spend a few minutes going through the survey for the bond. These questions are a little bit different. So on page 5, we are asking the standard questions. Is it fair? Easy to understand? Would you vote for it if this wasn't a referendum? This will require a legislature, but I'm still asking, would you vote if it was a referendum? And then on page 6, this is going to take a bit of time to explain. So there's a table on page 6. What we are asking you here is to choose one cell in this table, one number, and circle. And that number should be satisfying the following criteria. First, it's acceptable to you. That deal is personally acceptable to you. But you also believe that it will be acceptable to the industry. So if you're a quota holder, choose a number that's good for you, but you believe would also be acceptable to the stock whip. If you're in the stock whip group, choose a number that would be acceptable to you personally, but also you believe that quota holders would also agree. At least to the point that sufficient supermajority of 65% of non-solids or 65% of producers is in agreement with it. There's a fundamental trade-off there. You can either, as Matt mentioned before, I'm just going to re-emphasize, you can either go, well, first you need to choose the quota payment price, right? It's up to you to decide whether it's $100, $200, $300, $400, $500. Whatever you believe the industry will support, not just you, but what the industry can coalesce around. And then you have to choose which way you want to do it. Do you want to take a smaller assessment per hundredweight for a longer period of time, or a shorter period of time but bigger assessment per hundredweight? So take a moment to choose one number there. All right, yes.
Would the people that sell their quota, they would also then have to get assessed to pay for their own quota they sold?
Under this proposal, the assessments will still be on those that are grade A shippers in the state. So if somebody's quota is purchased and they remain in the industry, they would be assessed. If they leave the industry, if they retire, they wouldn't be assessed anymore. Just like right now, they're not assessed anymore. Now, this is the current proposal. They're not saying that's the only way to do it. If this idea makes it to phase 3, we can figure out different variations. One variation may be that if you participate in the buyout, if your quota is bought out, then you're subject to assessment for the next 5 years or something like that. But at least in the current proposal, the way it's written here, only grade A shippers will be assessed. Yes?
This number could vary considerably if you could work with the state and federal government to make it, number one, tax-free on the income, because you're obviously going to end up taking less. And then also if you could make the payout deductible for those that are paying to the program.
Very good point, sir. Would you please write it down on the page? And again, today is a conversation starter on these 11 ideas. Over the next few weeks, we got to trim it down to 3. December 1, we have 3 and we run with it. And we then dig in deeper to each of them. This would be a good example of further deepening our analysis of that. In the interest of time, I'm going to start with a proposal L on page 7, monetization of the quota. Okay, so if you think about the bond, it has a lot of attractive sides, but one side that perhaps is not as attractive is that you have to have all these committees agree if the state needs to support the bond, if we are writing the state creditworthiness. So could we have something like bond, but without state having to agree to back it up? Here's the way that you could do it. Like in the previous proposal, we would set a termination date. Any bond would have a termination date. That's the date at which the bond would be paid off. Here we would do the same. We would set a termination date and no possibility of referendums before that termination date. So once it's agreed, it's set in stone over that period of time. Sort of like sunset that we'll talk about later. But then, what's specific about this idea is that anybody who holds a quota certificate can take it anywhere. Not just to a fellow dairyman and ask, hey, would you buy my certificate? You have cows, so you're eligible. Anybody becomes eligible to buy quota certificate. So your bank, hedge funds, dairy economists at the University of Minnesota, anybody could buy a quota certificate. I'm not proposing this because I want to buy a quota, I'm just using that as an example. And so, but at a good price. Anybody who is not related with the dairy industry would be able to buy the quota certificate. What that creates is a higher demand for quota because the pool of eligible buyers is higher. So then whatever is decided, the duration, the assessment, etc., the quota price goes up because there's more demand for it. But unlike the bond, there's nobody who's going to sell your quota for you to Freddie Mac or someone. You take the initiative. And if you prefer to keep on receiving monthly payments, so be it. You don't have to sell out. But if you do prefer to be bought out, the market among fellow dairymen is no longer the only market. You can take it to your bank, you can take it to alternative investors or anyone else. That's the core of the quota monetization, increasing the market for quota.
So to increase the price of quota once we have the certainty about the duration of the program. That would also mean, as a corollary, that if you retire, you keep your quotas. So no more limits on 60 days. You know, under this proposal, if you currently own a quota certificate, you can take it with you. If you stop shipping milk, you'll still keep on receiving the assessments every month, unless you sell it to someone. So making it much, much more easy to monetize that stream of payments. That's the goal of the please take a moment to go through the page 7. The idea is summarized on the top. Is it fair? Is it easy to understand? Would you want to support this on a referendum? And then open-ended comments below. I'll give you a moment to do that. The third proposal in the second block, and after that we will have the second Q&A. The third proposal in the second block is on quota retirement. So we wanted to give you a set of options to that facilitate treating a particularly vulnerable group of producers in a more favorable way. If the community decides that should be done. I'm not the one saying they're vulnerable, this needs to be done. I'm just giving you options again. So in this particular option, in this particular proposal, this is proposal N on page 8 of the feedback booklet. We would take the quota monies, so that's $12 million every month, and we would carve out a slice of that. For the sake of the discussion, assume that it's $2.5 million. So we take all the pie, we slice out a slice. The rest goes to quota holders just like it is done right now. And if you take out $2.5 million, you're left with about $1.10, $1.11 that goes to quota holders. What do you do with that $2.5 million? Okay, well, you use that money to retire a quota. CDFA says anybody who's retiring from dairy business in the next 90 days can come to us and submit the price at which they want us, CDFA, to buy their quota. We have $2.5 million. We'll look at all the bids that come in, and we'll go from the bottom up. So whoever wanted the least amount of money is the highest on our list. We'll go down the list until we exhaust that $2.5 million this month. And if you're the only person retiring, you have 700 cows, there is enough money in here to buy your entire quota at $500. But if there are 15 people retiring, then the price at which it's bought out will go down. So this mechanism allows for the buyout at above market prices, but up to a level, and not for everyone, but you have to choose which group can use this. In this particular example, the retiring dairies can use that. What can we do with this proposal? If the price at which this is bought out is about $300 per pound, in 1 year you can retire about 100,000 pounds of quota out of 2.2 million that are currently in circulation. So it would take over 20 years to retire everything, maybe less a little bit. So this is not a program for retiring all of quota. This is envisioned that if you have some amount of time and you want to give a preferred status to those that are at the end of their productive lifetime as dairymen and have been perhaps investing in quota for their retirement, this is a way that you could give them a sweeter deal to send them off to retirement. The benefit, I guess, to the rest of the community would also be that if there's less milk, basis is better, prices will be better, a little bit better in the state. The benefits, if you're a retiring dairy, you can sell your quota potentially at a price that's higher than the current market clearing price. And how much higher, that depends on how many dairymen are retiring, of course. If you're a quota payer, the moment some quota pounds start getting retired is the moment when less money is needed for monthly payments to the quick pool. So your assessments can go down, and it will go down, I think we said around 2% per year or something like that. So not a lot, 1.5 cents, 2 cents a year. And then if you're a quota holder that is not currently retiring, your current quota payment will go down to about the same level as the Class 1 sales in the previous example. So that is our option N. If you could please take a moment to read through it at the top of page 8 and answer the same set of questions. Is it fair? How easy is it to understand? Would you vote for this if this was on a referendum? If you have any other thoughts. And as you write that, I'm going to open the floor for Q&A. We are 12:40, so 2 hours and 40 minutes into a meeting. So we have comfortably 15 minutes for Q&A if there are sufficient questions. I see a question in the back there.
You have another section?
Yes, sir.
So if you put a bid in for $500 now and there were no other bids that month, would you win the bid?
In this proposal, that would be the maximum that the CDFA would buy it for, yes. But you do have to retire within 90 days. They retired from their business altogether. Yes, sir.
Why is this proposal in only retiring?
Yeah, so this is, again, just a conversation starter. My point was that this method is not sufficient to
Repeat the question. Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. The question was, why would this only apply to retiring dairies and presumably not to all dairies? We wanted to in some way focus this program to a particular group. And one way would be to say that those are the retiring dairies. You could also say that those are dairies that have less than a certain number of cows, or dairies that have purchased or acquired their quota more than 10 years ago, or within the last 3 years. You can set the restrictions in different ways. But the central recognition is that $2.5 million per month is not a lot of money that can buy out quota from everyone.
But if you opened it up to everyone, it'd be more competitive, you might get the price lower, so you'd be able to require more quota.
That is true, but if that happens, then those that have been, so this proposal is trying to accomplish several purposes. One of the feedback that we heard from phase 1 is, I really invested in quota for my retirement. The quota goes away. I don't know what to do. I'm not going to be able to sustain my current lifestyle as I retire from dairy. So can you help us out? This is a proposal that answers that particular plea that we received. But it's up to the community, and not Matt and I. It's up to the community to design this program in full level of detail. But the core point is that you carve out from the QUIP assessment funds some slice, and you use that to retire quota. The more quota you retire, the lower the assessments can be the next month. If you want to take out of $12 million, if you want to take out $8 million for retirement, you can retire much more quota that month, but it also means that if you're not one of those bidding, your quota payments then go down substantially. So that's the trade. We have let me just go around the room to make sure that everybody has a chance. Yes, sir.
According to your calculations, well, if you take out 100 pounds of quota, it'll take, you said, 20 years. But after 20 years, is there a sunset clause in this proposal that after 20 years will be the more IOP, does quota go away, or does it have a continuation from there on, people that did not retire?
Yeah, so this proposal is currently presented as a standalone that does not call for a quota termination. It can be combined. You can easily see how this can be combined with a sunset. For example, if you set a 7-year sunset or a 5-year sunset or a 3-year sunset, whichever, if you set a deadline, then you only have a few years of retirement options, right? And you then definitely cannot retire everybody through this, right? So you then have to choose which subgroup of producers gets to benefit from this. And if you as producer community believe that that should be either be unrestricted, so everybody can bid, or it should be restricted to a particular subgroup, that's entirely up to the community to decide what is fair and moral or consensus building, etc. We just wanted to give you one constellation of the design choices to get the conversation started. As a reminder, we have a discussion on all three ideas: quota retirement, quota monetization, or the bond. We welcome questions on any of these three. Yes, sir.
Well, I guess it's just sort of on the quota monetization. I understand the idea. It's not a bad one, but how does everyone feel about that money leaving the industry altogether? When we get third parties investing, not just investment, but just now it's leaving the industry altogether, right? Does that mean what the price of the
Yeah, so there were really two elements to your question. The question was, how does everyone feel about money leaving the industry? So if somebody sells a quota certificate to a hedge fund manager in New York, then your quota assessments will be going to the other side of the continent. I'll be happy to answer that question on December 1 once we summarize the surveys. I try to think that I'm emotionally sensitive to the vibes in the room, but I dare not summarize the emotion in the room for you right now. So. Okay, any other questions? You can ask any questions on any of these three proposals. Two questions there in the back. Gentlemen, I didn't ask the question before. If you could, yes.
How did the $1.11 will be paid to all quota across the state?
That is correct. Yes. That is correct. The question was on quota retirement. Yes, this is assuming that we equalize our QAs. Yes.
So what if no one retires that month or wants to retire? What happens to that $2.5 million that's collected?
It stays in a fund that is used for auctions next month. Or you can send it back to quota holders. Either way. I think it might be, if I had the authority to do that, I'd probably say, keep it until the next month, so that to make sure that you do, at the end of the day, retire in non-pounds. You guys are so shy, I think I'm in Minnesota again. We're all good Scandinavians there. Any more questions? Yes, sir. Bill.
Just one thought. Did you think about the, in terms of the investor who might be buying the security, whether it's in a bond situation or whether it's in monetization, length of the instrument, I imagine, would be critical, right? In terms of assessing the risk, will buyers see more risk with a longer term instrument?
So the question that Bill Schick asked is, would buyers in general perceive bond with a longer payoff period to be more risky? That is in general the case. Anything that has more time until you get the money back is perceived as more risky. That's why typically long-term interest rates are higher than the short-term interest rates. That is correct, yes. Next question, yes?
When it comes to the bond, has there been any pre-investigative analysis as to the likelihood of the state of California accepting the proposal of a bond issuance?
I'm going to try to summarize your question. I'm not sure that I heard it correctly. But the question was, did we do any preliminary research whether this is even feasible from the legislative perspective? Is that
correct?
Yes. We have been cautioned that it would be that we cannot take it for granted. There are a lot of steps. There are a lot of people that would need to check off on this for it to happen. A lot of committees. I don't want to speculate whether it's completely non-feasible or fully doable. I think it just is important to state at this point that there will be a number of legislators and committees that will be likely involved in the process. Next question, please. Going once? Yes, sir.
On the quota retirement program, it's almost more
So did I.
How much did you consider, just opening it up to everyone instead of just retirees?
Yeah, so you can do that. You can do it that way, of course. My reasoning was the following: if you target only retiring dairies, you just might be able to design a program that covers everybody who's retiring that month. So in a sense, because not everybody is retiring all at once, this program may do justice to those that are just about to retire. If you open it to everyone, sure, some people may decide that they want to participate in this, but then those that are retiring are going to be sent off to their retirement with less of a retirement fund. So there are trade-offs. You can do anything anyway, but what's important is to understand that there are trade-offs. If it's implemented the way we designed it, then hopefully all retiring dairymen can retire with a reasonable price per quota that is, in their mind, reasonable, which means above the current market clearing price.
Lower the quota price, that'll lower the value of the quota.
That is correct, yes. But it wouldn't necessarily lower the, if you restrict who is eligible for participating in the retirement auction, it wouldn't necessarily lower the winning bid. Yes, sir, you had a question.
A comment and a question. The comment is, this having to look every month and how many people bid on it, and do they get 400 or 300 or 250 or 500? It seems more stable if you just said, pick a number. The price is 300, if you want to go out, 300. It doesn't say in your dialogue, but is there an assumption here that if somebody does retire, that they can't sell the quota to somebody else? If somebody actually retires, they have to retire that quota too?
No, there's no must here. There's no shall here. So this is just another option. If you're about to retire, you can either pursue this path or sell it to another dairyman. Of course, this program only makes sense if it offers a better deal than what the market offers at that point. If it offers the same deal as the market, then why bother making it more complicated? You can sell it on the market anyway. The reason why we wouldn't want to stipulate 300 as a fixed number is that what if somebody really does need to get out of the business that month and they would be willing to accept less? If you stipulate it's always 300 and you get so many bids in that you just don't have enough money to cover everyone, how do you do triage on who gets it and who doesn't, based on who was the first one to submit it? Then you have to come up with a different ranking scheme. And in our system, it's the size of the bid is the ranking scheme. Okay, well, we had a good discussion on this. We are 5 minutes to 1, almost 3 hours in. We have one more block to go. I'm going to give you a choice now. Do you want to go on a 5-minute break, reconvene in 1, or you just want to keep on plowing? No. Will do. The next one is the termination through a referendum. Is this yours? Yeah. Or is it mine? Okay. Yeah, so the next one is the page 9, document J, retire quota through referendum. Matt is going to take us through it. Start the new code.
Okay. So we went through the first block. The first block was all about keeping QUIP in its, or amending it. Then we went through the second block, which was about buying it out. Now we're talking about termination. And I'm going to start with, if you want to call it, simple termination or termination via referendum. I guess first I want to point out the different areas of the state. So as I talk about termination, I want to talk about who it affects, who benefits regionally. And so here I have the different RQA zones, which we've been talking about. Of course, $1.70 is zone 1, which is here in Southern California, and $1.05 here in the valley. If you can take a moment and try to make sure that you know which zone you're in, as we go through the next things. Next set. So there's some regional differences in who owns quota and how much quota they own. Of course, the regional differences have been influenced by where it made the most sense to own quota. Obviously, if you were in the South, you got more money for owning quota than you did if you were in the Valley. As a result of that, certain parts of the state end up being net receivers from the quota program, and certain parts of the state in aggregate tend to be net payers. So zones 1 and zone 2 here, they're net receivers, zone 1 being Southern California, zone 2 being Northern California, and then of course zone 5 being Kings, Kern, those counties, they're the biggest net payers. All the other parts of the state end up being net receivers or break even. Now this is an important idea because I don't think that people talk about, usually we talk about it just in terms of who owns quota and who doesn't. We don't typically break it down by what parts end up paying in and what parts end up taking. It's also important when you think about, well, what happens when you terminate quota, who's going to benefit and who's going to lose, and which areas would be most fair to expect to contract because quota went away, and which areas of the state might expand because quota went away. So if you think about this is amount of money per month. Per month, Zone 5 contributes around $2 million per month into the quota program on net. So if quota were to terminate in a given year, it would increase the average revenue in those 3 counties by about $24 million. On the other hand, the regions that would be most negatively affected are the north and the south. In that part of the state, somewhere around, on average, about half of the milk is covered by quota. So if quota were to go away, which areas would be most likely to contract or that would experience a negative supply shock because of quota terminating? It would be those areas. It's also important to recognize that it's the north and the south that have the most concentration of quota. So on average, somewhere around half of the quota in of the milk production in those areas are covered by quota. So you can imagine that there are a lot of high quota farms in those areas that are very concentrated in that asset. And so if quota were to terminate, it would affect those producers and individual producers in those areas to a larger effect than maybe on average other places. Okay, another thing I want to talk about is, well, who owns quota? One of the things that we had kind of first thought, we were challenged on, was that it was disproportionately small dairies that own quota, and that large dairies don't tend to own quota. We got pressed on this, and this is how we ended up with this information. What this chart shows is the by farm size in California. This is, I believe, milk production in October, amount of pounds. How much, on average, quota do they own? What we find is that the smallest farms tend to own a significant amount of quota relative to the rest of the milk producers, but as you go through the other size dairies, there isn't a clear trend. Just because you're bigger doesn't mean you own quota. Just because you're smaller doesn't mean you own quota. If you're thinking about carving out ways of special treatment for producers, or I talked about how we have two zones that are disproportionately affected to the negative by the termination of quota. Well, in terms of if you were to try to create a policy that just targeted a specific size of milk producer, the data would suggest the very smallest, those probably with less than 100 cows, but maybe there isn't a lot of great evidence for discriminating based on sizes greater than that. So the first thing I want to talk about quota termination, we already spent a lot of time talking about whether the 65% threshold or the 51% threshold. I just want to give you guys some numbers, and then I'll give you time to fill out your sheets. This is a chart that I put together that shows whether or not quota would pass or fail if put to a termination. If there was a termination referendum, whether it would pass or fail. Green on this chart is it passes, red is it fails. Okay, and then, so as I mentioned earlier, voter turnout, given where the numbers are, is hugely important. So on this axis, I have the percentage of net payers into QIP, how many of them turn out, and then on this other, we have net receivers from QIP, and how many of those turn out. As you can see, depending on where the votes turn out, there's a significant risk that at the 65% threshold, it fails or it passes. If all the net payers into QIP turn out, and all of the net receivers from QIP turn out, the referendum doesn't pass, according to my numbers. Now, if we were to take this and say, well, the 51% threshold, so we talked about the 65%, you talk about the 51% threshold, but arguably maybe there's an incentive that all the net payers into QIP don't turn out at all, and because they represent almost 65% of the state, the minimum is you have to have 51% participate, well then you wouldn't have the 51% affirm, and then it would go away. So it seems pretty likely, I'm not going to say absolute, but very likely that the 51% threshold quota terminates. At the 65% threshold, there's a lot of risk for either party. So I guess to just kind of summarize, and then I'll have you fill out your forms. Quota is termination of quota would affect producers in the state differently. Producers that would be the biggest beneficiaries are in those three counties in the Central Valley. The north and the south would be to the detriment of them in aggregate. The smallest farms are the ones that have the highest concentration of quota ownership. The other ones, there's no discernible trend, and that at the 65% threshold, there's risk of termination, and at the 51% threshold, it's very likely that if it went to a referendum, it would turn.
So if you look at page 9, document J, terminate quota through referendum, there are a couple of questions here that are different than other sheets. And I'm going to start with the second question here. The second question says, or it's a statement that you're asked to either agree or disagree with.
statement is holding the referendum under Chapter 3.5 rules, 51% majority needed to continue QUIP, is fair. In other words, what we are asking you is that if the petition is submitted, and now the secretary has to decide whether to hold a referendum or not, if she does decide to hold a referendum, would that be a fair decision or not a fair decision? If you think that that would be a fair decision, you can put agree or strongly agree. If you think that secretary deciding to hold a referendum is not something that she should have done, it's not a fair decision, you can put strongly disagree there. For the sake of balance, we also included the first question, that's asking exactly the same under Chapter 3. Notice that in Chapter 3 she has no degrees of freedom. If there is a valid petition, she has to go to a referendum. So you can answer that question if you want, but it's really not something that she has any leeway on. The third and the fourth question are asking you how you would vote on a referendum. So the third question is saying if there's a Chapter 3, the regular petition that you knew for last year, the 65% rule, if that referendum were to be called, would you vote to support it? To vote to support is to vote to terminate QUIP. So would you vote to terminate QUIP? If you would vote to terminate QUIP, then put strongly agree. If you would not vote to terminate QUIP, if you vote no on that referendum, if you want to keep QUIP, then you would put strongly disagree. Okay? When it comes to 51%, the fourth question, it's the other way around. The 51% referendum is not a referendum to terminate. It's a referendum to keep 3.5, Chapter 3.5 in place. So would you vote to continue QUIP? If you would vote to continue QUIP, you would put strongly agree. If you would not vote to continue QUIP, then put strongly disagree on the fourth question there. Let me know if I need to repeat any of this. I know it can be a little involved. Okay, so I think I'm pretty tall. I'm just going to stand here. So the last block of ideas deal with the sunset. The first of those envisions keeping everything in place as it is today, including RQAs, including everything else. And the only thing we're changing in document F on page 10, the only thing that we're changing here is that QUIP turns into a pumpkin a few years from now, right? It goes away at a specified date. So that's the basic sunset. Sunset is a type of a termination referendum. Sunset will be implemented through a referendum with a ballot that says, do you agree that QUIP will terminate? I'm just going to use some year for example. Do you agree that QUIP will terminate on December 31, 2025? Or 2023, 2027, whatever, right? But the ballot would give you a specific date and year, and if you vote yes, then you vote that you keep the program as is until that date, and then it goes away. That's the sunset. So it is, there's actually no more to it. That's what sunset is. Now I need to explain this table to you. Here we are not equalizing RQA in this particular flavor of the sunset. So that means that if you go for 5 years and you're in Chino, you will get a total of $356 per pound of quota over those 5 years. If you're in Tulare, over 5 years, you'll get $300.
And you can read the similar way, 3 years, 7 years, 10 years, 1 year. And this is just telling you if you go on for this many years, over the duration of that time, cumulatively, you will be receiving this much money for your quota. Now, if you could sell quota with only 5% interest or discount, then if the program goes for 5 years, this is the number that you could sell it for. This is the number that you could sell it for to someone who is going to be receiving payments as if they're in Chino, right? 315, 265. This makes it a little bit convoluted because it still keeps on RQAs. So this is the discounted cash flow at 5% discount rate. This is just a simple sum of cash flow over 1, 2, 3, and however many years. If you look at a feedback booklet, I'm asking you now a question I haven't asked you before. We've given you these tables here. And we are asking you to circle the number of years that you would personally support if it wasn't a referendum. But not only does it work for you, but you believe that many years is what it will take to bring people together to get this done. Right? So not just what works for you. It would be easy enough if you're a quota holder to just say, oh yeah, sure, 10 years, I'm in, right? But give us the number of years that you believe works for everyone, including those that are paying for this and that have to agree to this rather than go to a petition. So circle the number of years that you believe will be needed to get this done. And then below, the standard questions, fair, easy to understand, would you vote to support it in a referendum? Okay, need more time? By the way, I know the program was advertised until 1. That was before we knew that Donald Shipple would be coming. No? Yeah. So let's, with your permission, I will go to E1, variations of sunset. This one is the same as the previous one with one change. Equalize RQA to Tulare level. So notice that now everyone gets the same as Tulare in the previous example. 265 here. It's the same as 265 here. Which means that everybody gets $1.43 every year, and the assessment is 34 cents per 100 every month. There's nothing more to it. It's very simple. And just like before, on page 11, please circle the number of years that would work for you personally. You would be okay with it. And you believe that those number of years would be acceptable to anybody who would otherwise be submitting a petition to terminate quit. We got 2 more of these, and then we're done for real. Matt told you in the termination memo that some regions of the state will be more adversely affected as a region than others. In particular, the north and the south of the state have more of their milk covered in quota. Therefore, if quota were to go away, their regional income as an industry, as a milk shed, would go down more pronouncedly than in other parts of the state. So it is up to the community now to decide if you want to give those regions a bit longer sunset. Here's how we could do it. We could say, this is just one example, I'm not proposing this specific years, this is just to illustrate the principle. We could have 5-year sunsets for everyone, and then 3 more years for Chino and Petaluma. What I would like to draw your attention to is several elements here. First, how do we do this? Do we need legislature for this? We believe that you could do this by a combination of changing RQAs and having a referendum on termination. You could have a referendum that says, do you agree that QIP will terminate in 8 years, and that RQAs for zones 3, 4, and 5 will be negative 19.5 cents per pound of solids non-fat after year 5. What that would effectively do is have for these 3 zones be quota valued at 0 after 5 years, but for other zones, Chino and Petaluma, to have them continue for 3 more years. So referendum would do to do this. Second, how much would it cost to fund a longer sunset for these 2 zones? It would cost, if they don't buy any additional quota, if they just keep the quota pounds that they have today, it will cost you about 6 cents per 100 if all grade A shippers in the state are paying for that. And then a very good question was asked by Jeff yesterday in Chino. Well, if you design it this way, wouldn't you have Chino and Petaluma folks buying quota from everybody else after year 5, because quota is worthless in the rest of the state and it just has some value in those zones? That is correct. If you want to restrict that, you would probably need a legislative add-on to this that says this is only valid for quota that has been owned for more than 5 years or something like that, so that you eliminate that incentive of quota migration from the rest of the state to these 2 zones. If you don't do that, they may double the amount of quota they own. They still cannot own more than 100%, or at least they couldn't get paid under current rules. So if they just load up on quota, if you don't prevent it through some other means, then this 6 cents becomes 12 cents. But it's still just a small fraction of what it is today. Yes, sir.
Doesn't the North and South Valley already have an advantage, a 50-cent advantage due to the federal milk marketing order already?
The class 1 differentials are higher close to population centers. That is correct, yes.
Okay, so without quota, they still have an advantage, if you want to say just in price, over us.
I'm just going to repeat what I said before. The class 1 differentials are higher in those regions. And just keep in mind, I'm not advocating for this. I'm just giving you options. If you guys wanted to privilege the retiring dairies, we had an idea for that. If you wanted to privilege these 2 regions, we have an idea for that. It is up to community now to decide whether this is something that dies right here today or goes on to the phase 3 as one of the 3 ideas that are most favored by the industry. Okay, we have one more proposal and then we'll do a Q&A. This is the step-down sunset. In this proposal, every year the quota paid price goes down until it hits 0. Every year the assessments go down until they hit 0. An illustrative example is with 10 years. And over those 10 years, every year the quota pay price goes down by 10% until it vanishes. So the way you would do this is through, again, a referendum. A referendum question would say, do you approve of QIP terminating after 10 years and RQAs having this schedule over the next decade, with RQAs ratcheting up until basically the program goes away. So on page 13, we have a regular set of questions. Is it fair? Is the step down fair? Is it easy to understand? Would you support it? But then we have one specific question. If we were to use a step down, how many years
would you personally support for a sunset, and you also believe it suffice to generate supermajority of producers? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or more than 10. I'm going to open it now for Q&A. This is your last Q&A of the day before we wrap it up. Preferred question on these proposals? So the sunset and determination. If there are no questions on that, happy to answer any questions on that you've heard today. But first priority on questions on the sunset or termination. Everybody's hungry. They're just all burger. Yes, sir.
Would you do this last proposal you had? Would that be, do you set a price and then you sunset the price down to that price? Or do you just say it's this many years? Or how are you deciding the drop per year? Is that based on a full payout price of $300, or do you have years 279?
It's a very good question. So a simple version of the question was, how do you decide how much you ratchet down every year? So there are two ways that you can do this. You can either say, okay, we want the quota price to be 300, and then if this is going to be equal step down every year until sunset, then how many years do we need to get to 300? Or you can say, this is going to be 5 years. How much can we step down every year so that by the time we're done, the present value is 300, right? So in this particular example, you go all the way down to 0, but you can envision just as well an example where we go, for example, up only for 5 years, but we don't drop it by 20% each year, we drop it by 10% each year, and then last year it goes away completely. One thing that I forgot to ask you on the previous page 11, the no, not page 11. Page 12, longer sunset for zones 1 and 2. There was a question there that's really important. How many additional years should be approved for Chino and Petaluma regions? None. Everyone should be treated the same, or 1, 2, 3, 4, and more. So that would be an appropriate vehicle for you, appropriate place for you to express to us whether you think this approach is something to be considered or should be discarded. Yes, sir.
Has any analysis been done on what a termination, whether it's immediate or sunset, would do to, I guess we used to call it the over-base milk price, but what it would do to the federal marketing order price in California?
Yeah, so that's the part of our phase 3 charge. The phase 1 was soliciting ideas, phase 2 was presenting the ideas and getting feedback and trimming it down to 3, and phase 3 is also deep dive into consequences. So we did not do that analysis yet. That's part of the phase 3. Yes, sir.
So why didn't you make a step down with equalized RQAs? You only have a step down with prices as is. I think you should have a step down with equalized RQAs.
Yep, and on the page 14 of the survey, the last page of the survey, that's a very important page. We asked you to rank all the ideas. The top 3 ideas would be 1, 2, and 3. But if, like gentlemen, you think that some ideas should be combined, you can give us that feedback by saying in the space below on the page 14, which ideas would you combine to create your preferred solution? So in this case, you could say, okay, let's do a step down with an equalized RQAs. That would be one example of combination. Please, guys, page 14, we need to know of these 11 ideas you just heard, which are the 3 that you want to see go forward. And we are still in the Q&A mode, so any other questions are welcome at this point. Yes, ma'am.
You said that when we were looking at terminating on the zones, that except for the north and south extremity, the regions in the middle sought to gain $24 million a year. What does that mean? 24 million on the overbays, to his question, or?
Okay, so we look at it, everybody pays, all the shippers pay assessments, right? And then those assessments are given to quota certificate holders. Well, if you didn't have to take assessments, and if you didn't distribute that money, so if the program goes away, not accounting for any effect to the milk supply response, and not accounting for the fact that some milk may be retiring and therefore there'll be stronger basis, ignoring those effects. Just looking at the assessments not paid. So if the Tulare doesn't have to pay assessments anymore as a region, then they get to keep, was it $2 million? About $2 million a month. This is a month. Yeah, the Zone 5 region, right? Yeah, so that's the total amount of assessments that are currently going somewhere else in the state, not to the quota holders in the same zone. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, any more questions? It's really important that you rank these ideas, the last page. And then to wrap it up, I'm going to ask again Craig and Dina to say a few words. Craig, you want to take the stage for a moment? Say anything else? AJ. AJ? Okay. This is not an open mic, this is just concluding comments.
So, after all this has been said, at the end of the day, I think what we have to think about is the risk of us handing a petition in under Chapter 3.5. If you think that we're going to get a referendum, then you should think about that when you decide what deal you want to do, or what deal you want to make. If you don't think we can get a referendum, then do nothing. But I think the Stop Quip has showed everybody that we've been willing to go through this process. But at some point, we're not willing to continue. We were supposed to be done already by this time. So now we're going to go into February. Well, that's costing anybody who's not a net positive a lot of money. So at some point, we're going to get sick of it. And we're going to hand in our petition in. And there's another thing that hasn't been talked about. We think the process that they even designed the QUIP program wasn't done correctly. So we think that we would win in a lawsuit that terminated QUIP. So I think that's a bigger threat than even Chapter 3.5. So I think we, as an industry, need to nominate somebody. I mean, Craig and I and Stop QUIP, we have a good idea what we want. We want to quit making payments. The avenues we take to do that might take time. We realize that. So we need somebody from the other side that has the authority to talk to Craig and I. We're willing to listen. We've been saying that for 1 year now. We're willing to listen to any proposal you have. But it's not going to be a 5 or a 10-year deal. That's not going to happen. We think we have more, for lack of a better word, power than that. So that's my point. I think we need somebody from your side that can come and talk to Craig and I and Stop QUIP and get the conversations going. And by the way, we're not going to renew our contracts to keep the billboards up because we think they've served their purpose. So they're coming down. Thanks.
Thank you, AJ. AJ is going to be available after the meeting is done if you want to visit with him and Craig one-on-one or in smaller groups. But the formal meeting will wrap up with a few words from me.
AJ, can I just take over your contract on the billboards? You know, basically, I think where we're at as an industry right now is that we have two paths that we can travel down. We can either, you know, try to come up with something that we all want to do together, and give it a little bit of time and make sure we do a good job at it. Or we can head down the road of, lawsuits, litigation, legislation, and all of that stuff, from my experience, is very expensive and takes a long time. And I don't know that, I'm not interested in participating in that. I also stand here as, a member of the dairy families, and we don't believe that we have the authority or that we're in a position to negotiate for anyone on their behalf. Our charter is to create the opportunity for all the dairymen to get together and decide what we want to do. And that's the path we're on. I think we have a good plan to get this thing done pretty quick. I think that it's the shortest, cheapest, and best option for a unified dairy industry. So I would encourage you, whichever side you're on, to stay the course and let's get this thing done. And I appreciate you guys coming, and I just have a few notes here about, okay, so number one, if you want to know about the committee meetings that are coming up in the next 2 weeks, you need to be on our mailing list. So if you didn't sign in and give us your email, give it to us on your way out, or go to the website dairyfamilies.org and give us your email there. Also, if you have questions or any more comments or anything from this meeting, and you want to submit those questions to Marin and Matt, you can send them to the email address on our website, which is dairyfamilies@gmail.com, and we will forward those on to him. And also, if you know people who are interested in these 3 meetings this week, but we're not able to attend, we're hosting a webinar on Monday at 8 a.m. So, all you gotta do is have a computer or a phone, and you can log in, and Don will be on that call, Marin and Matt will be on that call, and we're gonna be going through the exact same thing, and people can ask questions through that, and there's a survey that they'll be able to take online in the whole bit. So we'll have the same experience available to people that were not able to attend these meetings. So share that with your friends and neighbors if you can. Otherwise, thank you guys very much, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Just what I wanted to do all this. I gotta go. You just talking about.
Oh, you feel this out, right? I gotta go home. I gotta.
I got one thing left to do from land out.
Okay.
All it is the small amount I could putting in the one that got Spanish.
Okay.
You know what?
Okay. Is it across?
It's across the other, yeah.
Okay.
And so I just want to do the budget.
Okay.
And once I have that, I'm going to send you all my about stuff.
Sounds good, because I have everything else pretty much done. I have everything, the final package together yesterday. I took all the California stuff that I'm starting the discussion now to figure out what we can do there. Just from a timing standpoint, I don't want to try to switch over to cash manager at the end of the year. So I think we would like to get here in November, and then probably actually switch over first of the year. So, yeah, you don't want to do that, I don't want to do that. Like, I'd rather get serious about that. But the idea is we get the map set up so that it's, Ryan and I are pushing it to do it without even but I pushed the map from the beginning. So I told him, yeah, I'm like, you could
Good to see you, buddy. Thanks for coming.
It's not like a huge issue.
And I asked
I saw your email.
if they had any issues with it. Like, no, I don't.
And California is really good with them, so not they all do, but I mean, it's like, it has the bed, so the cash flow is really good. So I'm hoping that it's the time So yeah, so that, and then they did book barricade day, so that got taken care of. So there's like a couple $100 in interest because we paid. So the only thing I got to finalize with John Deere is that I need to get them to pay off the resale certificate and all that takes care of because they sent us the money. So I will work through that. And then other than that, Cheryl got in touch with you, right?
Yeah, she emailed saying that she was going to start the title search.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. And then what I'm doing is kind of part of just doing a review. I've already had like pre-approval to release that. So as soon as she sends the paperwork, then we can get that done.
Okay, sounds good.
So do you see anything else between now and your end?
I don't.
Insurance items or services that we busy.
I'm sure there'll be something that I'm really
Okay. Just so you know, I have to go to training, not next week, but the week after this leadership training. It's actually in Tempe. I'm going to go see the Lakers play the Suns one night. I thought about you. I was like, oh.
Did you need to know where? Did you want to know? I never sent you where my analytics was current. Did you want that as of like 9:30 or not?
I'm doing everything kind of as of the end of the year, so I'm showing that in a peak position. So
okay.
Yeah, so we're good.
All
we're
right.
good on that. So and I'll show on your balance sheet at the end of 12:31.
Yeah.